Chapter 16 of By England's Aid by G.A. Henty. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16 The Escape. In one respect, Geoffrey said as they were talking over their chance of escape, I am sorry that the Bay has behaved so kindly to us. What is that? Stephen Bolderow asked in surprise. Well, I was thinking that were it not for that, we might manage to contrive some plan of escape, in concert with the galley slaves. Get them down to the shore here, row off to the galley, overpower the 3 or 4 men who live on board her, and make off with her. Of course, you should have had to accumulate beforehand a quantity of food and some barrels of water, for I have noticed that when they go out they always take their stores on board with them, and bring on shore on their return what has not been consumed. Still, I suppose that could be managed. However, it seems to me that our hands are tied in that direction by the kindness of the Bay. After his conduct to us, it would be ungrateful in the extreme for us to carry off his galley. So it would, Geoffrey. Besides, I doubt whether the plan would succeed. You may be sure that the Spaniards are as jealous as can be of the good fortune that we have met with, and were we to propose such a scheme to them, the chances are strongly in favor of one of them trying to better his own position by denouncing us. I would only trust them as far as I can see them. No, if we ever do anything, it must be done by ourselves. There is no doubt that if some night, when there is a strong wind blowing from the southeast, we were to get on board one of these fishing boats, hoist a sail, and run before it, we should not be far off from the coast of Spain before they started to look for us. But what better should we be there? We can both talk Spanish well enough, but we could not pass the Spaniards. Besides, they would find out soon enough we were not Catholics. And where should we be then? Either sent to row in their galleys, or clapped into the dungeons of the Inquisition, and like enough burnt alive at the stake. That would be out of the frying pan into the fire with vengeance. I think we might pass the Spaniards, Geoffrey said, for there is a great deal of difference between the dialects of the different provinces, and confined as you have been for the last 10 years with Spanish sailors, you must have caught their way of talking. Still, I agree with you, it will be better to wait for a bit longer for any chance that may occur, rather than risk landing in Spain again, where, even if we passed as natives, we should have as hard a work to get our living as we have here, and with no greater chance of making our way home again. During the time that they had been captives, some 3 or 4 vessels had been brought in by the corsair. The men composing the crews had been either sold as slaves to the Moors, or Arabs in the interior sent to Algiers, which town lay over 100 miles to the east. They were of various nationalities, Spanish, French, and Italian, as the 2 French learned from the talk of the natives, for they always abstained from going near the point where their prisoners were landed, as they were powerless to assist the unfortunate captives in any way, and the sight of their distress was very painful to them. One day, however, they learned from the people who were running down to the shore to see the captives landed from a ship that had been brought in by the corsair during the night, that there were 2 or 3 women among the captives. This was the first time that any females had been captured since their arrival at the place, for women seldom traveled far from their homes in those days, except the wives of high officials, journeying in great ships that were safe from the attack of the Moorish corsairs. Let us go down and see them, Bolderow said. I have not seen the face of a white woman for 9 years. I will go if you like, Geoffrey said. They will not guess that we are Europeans, for we are burnt as dark as the Moors. They went down to the landing place. 8 men and 2 women were landed from the boat. These were the sole survivors of the crew. They are Spaniards, Bolderow said. I pity that poor girl. I suppose the other woman is her servant. The girl, who was about 16 years of age, was very pale, and had evidently been crying terribly. She did not seem to heed the cries and threats with which the townspeople, as usual, assailed the newly arrived captives, but kept her eyes fixed upon one of the captives who walked before her. That is her father, no doubt, Geoffrey said. It is probably her last look at him. Come away, Stephen. I am awfully sorry we came here. I shall not be able to get that girl's face out of my mind for I don't know how long. Without a word they went back to their hut. They had no particular work that day. Geoffrey went restlessly in and out, sometimes pacing along the strand, sometimes coming in and throwing himself on the divan. Stephen Bolderow went on quietly mending a net that had been damaged the night before, saying nothing, but glancing occasionally with an amused look at his companion's restless movements. Late in the afternoon, Geoffrey burst out suddenly. Stephen, we must try and rescue that girl somehow from her fate. I suppose that was what it was coming to, Bolero said quietly. Well, let me hear all about it. I know you have been thinking it over ever since morning. What are your ideas? I don't know that I have any ideas beyond getting her and her father down to a boat and making off. Well, you certainly have not done much if you haven't got farther than that, Stephen said dryly. Now, if you had spent the day talking it over with me instead of wandering about like one out of his mind, we should have got a great deal farther than that by this time. However, I have been thinking for you. I know what you young fellows are. As soon as I saw that girl's face and looked at you, I was dead certain there was an end of peace and quietness, and that you would be bent upon some plan of getting her off. It did not need 5 minutes to show that I was right, and I have been spending my time thinking while you have thrown yours away and fidgeting. Well, I think it is worth trying. Of course, it will be a vastly more difficult job getting the girl and her father away than just taking a boat and sailing off, as we have often talked of doing. Then, on the other hand, it would altogether alter our positions afterwards. By his appearance and hers, I have no doubt that he is a well-to-do trader, perhaps a wealthy one. He walked with his head upright when the crowd were yelling and cursing, and is evidently a man of courage and determination. Now, if we had reached the Spanish coast by ourselves, we should have been questioned right and left, and, as I have said all along, they would soon have found out we were not Spaniards, for we could not have said where we came from, or given our past history, or said where our families lived. But it would be altogether different if we landed with them. Every one would be interested about them. We should only be two poor devils of sailors who had escaped with them, and he would help to pass it off and get us employment, so that the difficulty that has hitherto prevented us from trying to escape is very greatly diminished. Now, as to getting them away. Of course, she has been taken up to the bays, and no doubt he will send her as a present to the Bay of Algiers. I know that is what has been done several times before when young women have been captured. I have been thinking it over, and I do not see a possibility of getting to speak to her as long as she is at the bays. I do not see that it can be done anyhow. She will be indoors most of the time, and if she should go into the garden, there would be other women with her. Our only plan, as far as I can see at present, would be to carry her off from her escort on the journey. I do not suppose she will have more than 2, or at most 3 mounted men with her, and we ought to be able to dispose of them. As to her father, the matter is comparatively easy. We know the ways of prison, and I have no doubt we will get him out somehow. Only there is the trouble of the question of time. She has got to be rescued and brought back and hidden somewhere till nightfall. He has got to be set free the same evening, and we have to embark early enough to be well out of sight before daylight, and maybe there will not be a breath of wind stirring. It is a tough job, Geoffrey. Look at it which way you will. It is a tough job, Geoffrey agreed. I am afraid the escort will be stronger than you think. A present of this kind to the bay is regarded as important, and I should say 6 horsemen at least would be sent with her. In that case, an attempt at rescue would be hopeless. We have no arms, and if we had, we could not kill 6 mounted men, and if even one escaped, our plans would be detected. The question is, would they send her by land? It seems to me quite as likely that they might send her by water. Yes, that is likely enough, Geoffrey. In that case, everything would depend upon the vessel he sent her in. If it is the great galley, there is an end of it. If it is one of their little corsairs, it might be managed. We are sure to learn that before long. The bay might keep her for a fortnight or so, perhaps longer, and for her to recover somewhat from her trouble, and get up her good looks again, so as to add to the value of the present. If she were well and bright, she would be pretty enough for anything. In the meantime, we can arrange our plans for getting her father away. Of course, if she goes with a big escort on horseback, or she goes in the galley, there is an end of our plans. I am ready to help you, Geoffrey, if there is a chance of success, but I am not going to throw away my life if there is not, and unless she goes down in a coaster, there is an end of the scheme. I quite agree to that, Geoffrey replied. We cannot accomplish impossibilities. They learned upon the following day that 3 of the newly arrived captives were to take the places of galley slaves who had been killed in the capture of the Spanish ship, which had defended itself stoutly, and that the others were to be sold for work in the interior. It is pretty certain, Bolero said, that the traitor will not be one of the 3 chosen for the galley. The work would break him down in a month. That makes that part of the business easier, for we can get him away on the journey inland, and hide him up here until his daughter is sent off. Geoffrey looked around the bare room. Well, I do not say as how we could hide him in here, Bolero said in answer to the look. But we might hide him somewhere among the sandhills outside the place and take him food at night. Yes, we might do that, Geoffrey agreed. That could be managed easily enough, I should think, for there are clumps of bushes scattered all over the sandhills half a mile back from the sea. The trouble will be if we get him here and find out after that we cannot rescue his daughter. That will make no difference, Bolero said. In that case, we will take off with him alone. Everything else will go on just the same. Of course, I should be very sorry not to save the girl, but as far as we are concerned, if we save the father, it will answer our purpose. Geoffrey made no reply. Just at that moment, his own future was a very secondary matter in comparison to the rescue of this unhappy Spanish girl. Geoffrey and his companion had been in the habit of going up occasionally to the prison. They had won over the guard by small presents, and were permitted to go in and out with fruit and other little luxuries for the galley slaves. They now abstained from going near the place, in order that no suspicion might fall upon them after his escape of having had any communication with the Spanish trader. Shortly after the arrival of the captives, 2 merchants from the interior came down, and Geoffrey learned that they had visited the prison, and had made a bargain with the Bey for all the captives except those transferred to the galley. The 2 companions had talked the matter over frequently, and had concluded it was best that only one of them should be engaged in the adventure, for the absence of both might be noticed. After some discussion, it was agreed that Geoffrey should undertake the task, and that Bolero should go alone to the house where they were now at work, and should mention that his friend was unwell, and was obliged to remain at home for the day. As they knew the direction in which the captives should be taken, Geoffrey started before daybreak, and kept steadily along until he reached a spot where it was probable they would halt for the night. It was 20 miles away, and there was here a well of water and a grove of trees. Late in the afternoon he saw the party approaching. It consisted of the merchants, 2 armed Arabs, and the 5 captives, all of whom were carrying burdens. They were crawling painfully along, overpowered by the heat of the sun, by the length of the journey, and by the weight they carried. Several times the Arabs struck them heavily with their sticks to force them to keep up. Geoffrey retired from the other side of the clump of trees, and lay down in a depression of the sandhills until darkness came on, when he again entered the grove, and crawling cautiously forward, made his way close up to the party. A fire was blazing, and a meal had been already cooked and eaten. The traders and the 2 Arabs were sitting by the fire. The captives were lying extended on the ground. Presently, at the command of one of the Arabs, they rose to their feet, and proceeded to collect some more pieces of wood for the fire. As they returned, the fire fell on the gray hair of the man upon whom Geoffrey had noticed the girl's eyes were fixed. He noticed the place where he lay down, and had nothing to do now but to wait until the party were asleep. He felt sure that no guard would be set, for any attempt on the part of the captives to escape would be nothing short of madness. There was nowhere for them to go, and they would simply wander about until they died of hunger and exhaustion, or until they were recaptured, in which case they would be almost beaten to death. In an hour's time the traders and their men lay down by the fire, and all was quiet. Geoffrey crawled round until he was close to the Spaniard. He waited until he felt sure that the Arabs were asleep, and then crawled up to him. The man started as he touched him. "Silence, senor," Geoffrey whispered in Spanish. "I am a friend, and have come to rescue you." "I care not for life. A few days of this work will kill me, and the sooner the better. I have nothing to live for. They killed my wife the other day, and my daughter is a captive in their hands. I thank you, whoever you are, but I will not go." "We are going to try to save your daughter, too," Geoffrey whispered. "We have a plan for carrying you both off." The words gave new life to the Spaniard. "In that case, sir, I am ready. Whoever you are, whom God has sent to my aid, I will follow you blindly, whatever comes of it." Geoffrey crawled away a short distance, followed by the Spaniard. As soon as they were well beyond the faint light now given out by the expiring fire, they rose to their feet, and gaining the track, took their way on the backward road. As soon as they were fairly away, Geoffrey explained to the Spaniard who he was, and how he had undertaken to endeavor to rescue him. The joy and gratitude of the Spaniard were too deep for words, and he uttered his thanks in broken tones. When they had walked about a mile, Geoffrey halted. "Sit down here," he said. "I have some meat and fruit here, and a small skin of wine. We have a long journey before us, for we must get near the town you left this morning, before daybreak, and you must eat to keep up your strength." "I did not think," the Spaniard said, "when we arrived at the well, that I could have walked another mile, had my life depended upon it. Now I feel a new man after the fresh hope you have given me. I no longer feel the pain of my bare feet or the blisters the sun has raised on my naked back. I am struggling now for more than life, for my daughter. You shall not find me fail, sir." All night they toiled on. The Spaniard kept his promise, and utterly exhausted as he was, and great as was the pain in his limbs, held on bravely. With the first dawn of morning they saw the line of the sea before them. They now turned off from the track, and in another half-hour the Spaniard took shelter in a clump of bushes in a hollow, while Geoffrey, having left him with the remainder of the supply of provisions and water, pursued his way, and reached a hut just as the sun was shining in the east, and without having encountered a single person. "Well, have you succeeded?" Bolero asked eagerly as he entered. "Yes, I have got him away. He is in hiding within a mile of this place. He kept on like a hero. I am utterly tired myself, and how he managed to walk the distance after what he had gone through in the day is more than I can tell. His name is Mendez. He is a trader in Cadiz, and owns many vessels. He was on his way to Italy with his wife and daughter in one of his own ships, in order to gratify the desire of his wife to visit the holy places at Rome. She was killed by a cannon shot during the flight, and his whole heart is now wrapped up in his daughter. And now, Stephen, I must lie down and sleep. You will have to go to work alone today again, and can truly say that I am still unfit for labor." 4 days later it became known in the little town that a messenger had arrived from the merchant who had brought the slaves from the bay, saying that one of them had made his escape from their first halting place. "The dog will doubtless die in the desert," the merchant wrote, "but if he should find his way down, or you should hear of him as arriving in any of the villages, I pray you to send him up to me with a guard. I will so treat him that it will be a lesson to my other slaves not to follow his example." Every evening after dark, Geoffrey went out with a supply of food and water to the fugitive. For a week he had no news to give him as to his daughter, but on the 8th night he said that he and his companion had that morning been sent by the Bey on board the largest of the coasting vessels in the port, with orders to paint the cabins and put them in a fit state for the reception of a personage of importance. "This is fortunate indeed," Geoffrey went on. "No doubt she is intended for the transport of your daughter. Her crew consists of a captain and 5 men, but at present they are living ashore, and as we will be going backwards and forwards to her, we ought to have little difficulty in getting on board and hiding away in the hold before she starts. I think everything promises well for the success of our scheme." The Bay superintendent came down the next day to see how matters were going on board the vessel. The painting was finished that evening, and the next day 2 slaves brought down a quantity of hangings and cushions, which Geoffrey and his companion had assisted the superintendent to hang up and place in order. Provisions and water had already been taken on board, and they learnt that the party who were to sail in her would come off early in the next morning. At midnight, Geoffrey, Bolero, and the Spaniard came down to the little port, embarked in a fisherman's boat moored at the stairs, and noiselessly rowed off to the vessel. They mounted to her deck, barefooted. Bolero was the last to leave the boat, giving her a vigorous push with his foot in the direction of the shore, from which the vessel was but some 40 yards distant. They descended to the hold, where they remained perfectly quiet until the first light of dawn enabled them to see what they were doing, and then moved some baskets full of vegetables and concealed themselves behind them. A quarter of an hour later they heard a boat come alongside, and the voices of the sailors. Then they heard the creaking of cordage as the sails were let fall in readiness for a start. Half an hour later another boat came alongside. There was a trampling of feet on the deck above them, and the Bey's voice giving orders. A few minutes later the anchor was raised. There was more talk on deck, and then they heard a boat push off, and knew by the rustle of water against the planks beside them that the vessel was under way. The wind was light and the sea perfectly calm, and beyond the slight murmur of the water, those below could not have known that the ship was in motion. It was very hot down in the hold, but fortunately the crew had not taken the trouble to put on the hatches, and at times a faint breath of air could be felt below. Geoffrey and his companion talked occasionally in low tones, but the Spaniard was so absorbed by his anxiety as to the approaching struggle, and the thought that he might soon clasp his daughter in his arms, that he seldom spoke. No plans could be formed as to the course they were to take, for they could not tell whether those of the crew off duty would retire to sleep in the little forecastle, or would lie down on deck. Then, too, they were ignorant as to the number of men who had come on board with the captive. The overseer had mentioned the day before that he was going, and it was probable that 3 or 4 others would accompany him. Therefore they had to reckon upon 10 opponents. Their only weapons were 3 heavy iron bolts, some 2 feet long. These Boldero had purchased in exchange for a few fish, when a prize brought in was broken up as being useless for the purposes of the Moors. "What I reckon is," he said, "that you and I ought to be able to settle 2 apiece of these fellows before they fairly know what is happening. They ought very well to account for another, so that only leaves 5 of them, and 5 against 3 are no odds worth speaking of, especially when the 5 are woke up by a sudden start, and ain't sure how many there are against them. I don't expect much trouble over the affair." "I don't want to kill more of the poor fellows than I can help," Geoffrey said. "No more do I, but you see, it's got to be either killing or being killed, and I am perfectly certain which I prefer. Still, if the beggars are at all reasonable, I ain't for hurting them, but the first few we have got to hit hard. When we get matters a little even, we can speak them fair." The day passed slowly, and in spite of their bent and cramped position, Geoffrey and Stephen Boldero dozed frequently. The Spaniard never closed an eye. He was quite prepared to take his part in the struggle, and he was not yet 50 years of age. His assistance was not to be despised, but the light-hearted carelessness of his companions, who joked under their breath, and laughed and ate unconcernedly with a life-and-death struggle against heavy odds before them, surprised him much. As darkness came on, the party below became wakeful. Their time was coming now, and they had no doubt whatever as to the result. Their formidable opponents would be the men who came on board with the basin superintendent, as these, no doubt, would be fully armed. As for the sailors, they might have arms on board, but these would not be ready to hand, and it was really only with the guards they would have to deal. "I tell you what I think would be a good plan, Stephen," Geoffrey said suddenly. "You see, there is plenty of spare line down here. If we wait until they are all asleep, we can go round and tie their legs together, or put ropes round their ankles and fasten them to ring bolts. If we could manage that without waking them, we might capture the vessel without shedding any blood, and might get them down into the hold one after the other." "I think that is a very good plan," Stephen agreed. "I do not like the thought of knocking sleeping men on the head any more than you do, and if we are careful, we might get them all tied up before the alarm is given. There, the anchor has gone down. I thought very likely they would not sail at night. That is capital. You may be sure that they will be pretty close inshore, and they probably will have only 1 man on watch, and as likely as not even 1, for they will not dream of any possible danger." For another 2 hours the sound of talk on deck went on, but at last all became perfectly quiet. The party below waited for another half-hour, and then noiselessly ascended the ladder to the deck, holding in one hand a cudgel, and in the other a number of lengths of line cut about 6 feet long. Each as he reached the deck lay down flat. The Spaniards had been told to remain perfectly quiet, while the other 2 went about their task. First they crawled aft, for the bay's guards would, they knew, be sleeping at that end, and working together they tied the legs of these men without rousing them. The ropes could not be tightly pulled, as this would at once have disturbed them. They were, therefore, fastened somewhat in the fashion of manacles, so that, although the men might rise to their feet, they would fall headlong the moment they tried to walk. In addition, other ropes were fastened to these, and taken from one man to another. Then their swords were drawn from their sheaths, and their knives from their sashes. The operation was a long one, as it had to be conducted with the greatest care and caution. They then crept back to the hatchway, and told the Spaniard that the most formidable enemies had been made safe. "Here are a sword and knife for you, señor. And now, as we are all armed, I consider the ship as good as won, for the sailors are not likely to make much resistance by themselves. However, we will secure some of them. The moon will be up in half an hour, and that will be an advantage to us." The captain and 3 of the sailors were soon tied up like the others. 2 men were standing in the bow of the vessel, leaning against the bulwarks, and when the moon rose, it could be seen by their attitude that both were asleep. "Now, we may as well begin," Geoffrey said. "Let us take those 2 fellows in the bow by surprise, hold a knife to their throats, and tell them that if they utter the least sound we will kill them. Then we will make them go down into the forecastle and fasten them there." "I am ready," Stephen said, and as they stole forward to the 2 sleeping men, they grasped them suddenly by the throat and held a knife before their eyes, Boldero telling them in a stern whisper that if they uttered a cry they would be stabbed to the heart. Paralyzed by the sudden attack, they did not make the slightest struggle, but accompanied their unknown assailants to the forecastle, and were there fastened in. Joined now by the Spaniard, Geoffrey and his companion went aft, and roused one of the sleepers there with a threat similar to that which silenced the other sailors. He was, however, a man of different stuff. He gave a loud shout and grappled with Boldero, who struck him a heavy blow with his fist in the face, and this for a moment silenced him. But the alarm had been given, and the superintendent and the two men struggled to their feet, only, however, to fall prostrate as soon as they tried to walk. "Lie quiet and keep silent," Boldero shouted in a threatening voice. "You are unarmed and at our mercy. Your feet are bound and you are perfectly helpless. We do not wish to take your lives, but unless you are quiet we shall be compelled to do so." The men had discovered by this time that their arms had gone, and were utterly disconcerted by the heavy and unexpected fall they had just had. Feeling that they were indeed at the mercy of their captors, they lay quiet. "Now then," Boldero went on, "one at a time. Keep quiet, you rascals there," he broke off, shouting to the sailors who were rolling and tumbling on the deck forward, "or I will cut all your throats for you. Now then, Geoffrey, do you and the Signor cut the rope that fastens that man on the port side to his comrades. March him to the hatchway and make him go down into the hold. Keep your knives ready and kill him at once if he offers the slightest resistance." One by one, the superintendent, the 3 guards, the captain, and the sailors were all made to descend into the hold, and the hatches were put over it and fastened down. "Now, Signor," Geoffrey said, "we can spare you." The Spaniard hurried to the cabin, opened the door, and called out his daughter's name. There was a scream of delight within, as Dolores Mendez, who had been awakened by the tumult, recognized her father's voice, and leaping up from her couch, threw herself into his arms. Geoffrey and his companion now opened the door of the forecastle and called the 2 sailors out. "Now," Boldero said, "if you want to save your lives you have got to obey our orders. First of all, fall to work and get up the anchor, and then shake out the sails again. I will take this helm. Geoffrey, do you keep your eye on these 2 fellows. There's no fear of their playing any tricks now that they see they are alone on deck, but they might, if your back were turned, unfasten the hatches. However, I do not think we need fear trouble that way. As for aught they know, we may have cut the throats of all the others." A few minutes later, the vessel was moving slowly through the water, with her head to the northwest. "We must be out of sight of land if we can by morning," Stephen said, when Geoffrey, 2 hours later, came to take his place at the helm. "At any rate, until we have passed the place we started from. Once beyond that, it does not matter much, but it will be best either to keep out of sight of land altogether, or else to sail pretty close to it, so that they can see that the boat is one of their own craft. We can choose which we will do when we see which way the breeze sets in the morning." It came strongly from the south, and they therefore determined to sail direct for Carthagena. End of Chapter 16. The Escape. Recorded by Laura Brenner, close to Grettinger, Iowa, on April 28, 2026. Chapter 17 of My England's Aid by G.A. Henty. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. A Spanish Merchant. As soon as the sails had been set and the vessel was under way, the Spaniard came out from the cabin. "My daughter is attiring herself, Signor," he said to Stephen Boldero, for Geoffrey was at the time at the helm. "She is longing to see you, and to thank you for the inestimable services you have rendered to us both. But for you I should now be dying or dead, my daughter a slave for life in the palace of the bay. What astonishes us both is that such noble service should have been rendered to us by 2 absolute strangers, and not strangers only, but by Englishmen, a people with whom Spain is at war, and who assuredly can have no reason to love us. How came you first to think of interesting yourself on our behalf?" "To tell you the truth, Signor," Stephen Boldero said bluntly, "it was the sight of your daughter, and not of yourself, that made us resolve to save you if possible, or rather, I should say, made my friend Geoffrey do so. After 10 years in the galleys, one's heart gets pretty tough, and although even I felt a deep pity for your daughter, I own it would never have entered in my mind to risk my neck in order to save her. But Geoffrey is younger and more easily touched, and when he saw her as she landed, pale and white and grief-stricken, and yet looking as if her own fate touched her less than the parting from you, my good friend Geoffrey Vickars was well nigh mad, and declared that in some way or other, and at whatever risk to ourselves, you must both be saved. In this matter I have been but a passive instrument in his hands, as indeed was only right that I should be, seeing that he is of gentle blood, and an esquire serving under Captain Vere in the army of the Queen, while I am but a rough sailor. What I have done partly because his heart was in the matter, partly because the adventure promised, if successful, to restore me to freedom, and partly also, Senor, for the sake of your brave young daughter." "Ah, you are modest, sir," the Spaniard said. "You are one of those who belittle your own good deeds. I feel, indeed, more grateful than I can express to you as well as to your friend." The merchant's daughter now appeared at the door of the cabin. Her father took her hand and led her up to Boldero. "This, Dolores, is one of the 2 Englishmen who have, at the risk of their lives, saved me from death, and you from worse than death. Thank him, my child, and to the end of your life never cease to remember him in your prayers." "I am glad to have been of assistance, Senora," Boldero said as the girl began to speak. "But as I have just been telling your father, I have played but a small part in the business. It is my friend, Don Geoffrey Vickars, who has been the leader in the matter. He saw you as you landed at the boat, and then and there swore to save you. All that has been done has been under his direction. It was he who followed and rescued your father. I have really had nothing to do with the affair, beyond hiding myself in the hole and helping to tie up your Moors." "Ah, sir," the girl said, laying her hands earnestly upon the sailor's shoulder, "it is useless for you to try to lessen the services you have rendered us. Think of what I was but an hour since, a captive, with the most horrible of all fates before me, and with the belief that my father was dying by inches in the hands of some cruel taskmaster, and now he is beside me, and I am free. That has been done by 2 strangers, men of a nation which I have been taught to regard as an enemy. It seems to me that no words that I can speak could tell you even faintly what I feel, and it is God alone who can reward you for what you have done." Leaving Boldero, the Spaniard and his daughter went to the stern, where Geoffrey was standing at the helm. "My daughter and I have come to thank you, Senor, for having saved us from the worst of fates, and restoring us to each other. Your friend tells me that it is to you it is chiefly due that this has come about, for that you were so moved at pity at the sight of my daughter when we first landed, that you declared at once that you would save her from her fate at whatever risk to yourself, and that since then he has been but following your directions." "Then if he says that, Senor, he belies himself. I was, it is true, the first to declare that we must save your daughter at any cost, if it were possible to do so, but had I not said so, I doubt not he would have announced the same resolution. Since then we have planned everything together, and as he is older and more experienced than I am, it was upon his opinion that we principally acted. We had long made up our minds to escape when the opportunity came. Had it not been that we were stirred into action by seeing your daughter in the hands of the Moors, it might have been years before we decided to run the risks. Therefore, if you owe your freedom to us, to some extent we owe ours to you, and if we have been your protectors so far, we hope that when we arrive in Spain you will be our protectors there, for to us Spain is as much an enemy's country as Barbary." "That you can assuredly rely upon," the trader replied. "All that I have is at your disposal." For an hour they stood talking. Dolores said but little. She felt no shyness with the stalwart sailor, but to this youth, who had done her such signal service, she felt unable so frankly to express her feelings of thankfulness. By morning, the coast of Africa was but a faint line on the horizon, and the ship was headed west. Except when any alteration of the sails was required, the 2 Moors who acted as the crew were made to retire into the forecastle, and there were fastened in, Geoffrey and Boldero sleeping by turns. After breakfast, the little party gathered round the helm, and at the request of Juan Mendez, Geoffrey and Stephen both related how it befell that they had become slaves to the Moors. "Your adventures are both singular," the trader said when they had finished. "Yours, Don Geoffrey, are extraordinary. It is marvelous that you should have been picked up in that terrible fight, and should have shared in all the perils of that awful voyage back to Spain, without its being ever suspected that you were English. Once landed in the service, as you say, of Senor Burke, it is not so surprising that you should have gone freely about Spain. But your other adventures are wonderful, and you and your friend were fortunate indeed in succeeding, as you did, in carrying off the lady he loved, and deeply they must have mourned your supposed death on the deck of the Moorish galley. And now, tell me, what are your plans when you arrive in Spain?" "We have no fixed plans, save that we hope some day to be able to return home," Geoffrey said. "Stephen here could pass well enough as a Spaniard when once ashore, without being questioned, and his idea is, if there is no possibility of getting on board an English or Dutch ship at Cadiz, to ship on board a Spaniard, and to take his chance of leaving her at some port at which she may touch. As for myself, although I speak Spanish fluently, my accent would at once betray me to be a foreigner. But if you will take me into your house for a time until I can see a chance of escape, my past need not be inquired into. You could, of course, mention, were it asked, that I was English by birth, but had sailed on the Armada with my patron, Mr. Burke, and it would naturally be supposed that I was an exile from England." "That can certainly be managed," the trader said. "I fear that it will be difficult to get you on board a ship, either of your countrymen or of the Hollanders. These are most closely watched, lest fugitives from the law or from the Inquisition should escape on board them. Still, some opportunity may sooner or later occur, and the latter the better pleased shall I be, for it will indeed be a pleasure to have you with me." In the afternoon, Geoffrey said to Stephen, "I have been thinking, Stephen, about the men in the hold, and I should be glad for them to return to their homes. If they go with us to Spain, they will be made galley slaves, and this I should not like, especially in the case of the Bey's superintendent. The Bey was most kind to us, and this man himself always spoke in our favor to him, and behaved well to us. I think, therefore, that out of gratitude to the Bey we should let them go. The wind is fair, and there are, so far as I can see, no signs of any change of weather. By tomorrow night the coast of Spain will be in sight. I see no reason, therefore, why we should not be able to navigate her until we get near the land, when Mendez can engage the crew of some fishing boat to take us into a port. If we put them into the boat with plenty of water and provisions, they will make the coast by morning, and as I should guess that we must at present be somewhere abreast of the port from which we started, they will not be very far from home when they land." "I have no objection whatever, Geoffrey. As you say, we were not treated badly, at any rate, from the day when the Bey had us up to his house, and after 10 years in the galleys, I do not wish my worst enemies such a fate. We must, of course, be careful how we get them into the boat." "There will be 3 of us with swords and pistols, and they will be unarmed," Geoffrey said. "We will put the 2 men now in the forecastle into the boat first, and let the others come up one by one and take their places. We will have a talk with the superintendent first, and give him a message to the Bey, saying that we are not ungrateful for his kindness to us, but that of course we seized the first opportunity that presented itself of making our escape, as he would himself have done in similar circumstances. Nevertheless, that, as proof of our gratitude to him, we, for his sake, release the whole party on board, and give them the means of safely returning." An hour later, the boat, pulled by 4 oars, left the side of the ship with the crew, the superintendent and guards, and the 2 women who had come on board to attend upon Dolores upon the voyage. The next morning the vessel was within a few miles of the Spanish coast. An hour later a fishing boat was hailed, and an arrangement made with the crew to take the vessel down to Carthagena, which was, they learned, some 50 miles distant. The wind was now very light, and it was not until the following day that they entered the port. As it was at once perceived that the little vessel was Moorish in rigging and appearance, a boat immediately came alongside to inquire whence she came. Juan Mendez had no difficulty in satisfying the officer as to his identity, he being well known to several traders in the town. His story of the attack upon his ship by Barbary pirates, its capture, and his own escape, and that of his daughter by the aid of 2 Christian captives, excited great interest as soon as it became known in the town, for it was rare indeed that a captive ever succeeded in making his escape from the hands of the Moors. It had already been arranged that, in telling his story, the trader should make as little as possible of his companions' share in the business, so that public opinion should not be attracted towards them. He himself, with Dolores, at once disembarked, but his companions did not come ashore until after nightfall. Stephen Bolderow took a Spanish name, but Geoffrey retained his own, as the story that he was traveling as a servant with Mr. Burke, a well-known Irish gentleman who had accompanied the Armada, was sufficient to account for his nationality. Under the plea that he was anxious to return to Cadiz as soon as possible, Señor Mendez arranged for horses and mules to start the next morning. He had sent off 2 trunks of clothes to the ship an hour after he landed, and the 2 Englishmen therefore escaped all observation. As they wandered about for an hour or 2 after landing, and did not go to the inn where Mendez was staying until it was time to retire for bed. The next morning the party started. The clothes that Geoffrey was wearing were those suited to an employee in a house of business, while those of Bolderow were such as would be worn by the captain or mate of a merchant vessel on shore. Both were supplied with arms, for although the party had nothing to attract the cupidity of robbers, beyond the trunks containing the clothes purchased on the preceding day, and the small amount of money necessary for their travel on the road, the country was so infested by bands of robbers that no one traveled unarmed. The journey to Cadiz was, however, accomplished without adventure. The house of Señor Mendez was a large and comfortable one. Upon the ground floor were his offices and storerooms. He himself and his family occupied the 2 next floors, while in those above his clerks and employees lived. His unexpected return caused great surprise, and in a few hours a number of acquaintances called to hear the story of the adventures through which he had passed, and to condole him on the loss of his wife. At his own request, Stephen Bolderow had been given in charge of the principal clerk, and a room assigned him in the upper story. "I shall be much more comfortable," he said, "among your people, Don Mendez. I am a rough sailor, and 10 years in the galleys don't improve any manners a man may have had. If I were among your friends, I would be out of place and uncomfortable, and should always have to be bowing and scraping and exchanging compliments. And besides, they would soon find out my Spanish was doubtful. I talk a sailor's slang, but I doubt if I should understand pure Spanish. Altogether, I should be very uncomfortable, and should make you uncomfortable, and I would very much rather take my place among the men that work for you until I can get on board a ship again." Geoffrey was installed in the portion of the house occupied by the merchant, and was introduced to him by his friends, simply as the English gentleman who had rescued him and his daughter from the hands of the Moors, it being incidentally mentioned that he had sailed in the Armada, and that he had fallen into the hands of the corsairs in the course of a voyage made with his friend Mr. Burke to Italy. He at once took his place as a friend and assistant of the merchant, and as the latter had many dealings with Dutch and English merchants, Geoffrey was able to be of considerable use to him in his written communications to the captains of the various vessels of those nationalities in the port. "I think," the merchant said to him a fortnight after his arrival in Cadiz, "that, if it would not go against your conscience, it would be most advisable that you should accompany me sometimes to church. Unless you do this, sooner or later it is sure to be roused, and you know that if you were once suspected of being a heretic, the Inquisition would lay its hands upon you in no time." "I have no objection whatever," Geoffrey said. "Were I questioned, I should at once acknowledge that I was a Protestant, but I see no harm in going to a house of God to say my prayers there, while others are saying theirs in a different manner. There is no church of my own religion here, and I can see no harm whatever in doing as you suggest." "I am glad to hear that that is your opinion," Señor Mendez said, "for it is the one point concerning which I was uneasy. I have ordered a special mass at the church of St. Dominic tomorrow, in thanksgiving for our safe escape from the hands of the Moors, and it would be well that you should accompany us there." "I will do so most willingly," Geoffrey said. "I have returned thanks many times, but shall be glad to do so again in a house dedicated to God's service." Accordingly, the next day, Geoffrey accompanied Don Mendez and his daughter to the church of St. Dominic, and as he knelt by them, wondered why men should hate each other because they differed as to the ways and methods in which they should worship God. From that time on, he occasionally accompanied Señor Mendez to the church, saying his prayers earnestly in his own fashion, and praying that he might some day be restored to his home and friends. He and the merchant had frequently talked over all possible plans for his escape, but the extreme vigilance of the Spanish authorities with reference to the English and Dutch trading ships seemed to preclude any possibility of his being smuggled on board. Every bale and package was closely examined on the quay before being sent off. Spanish officials were on board from the arrival to the departure of each ship, and no communication whatever was allowed between the shore and these vessels, except in boats belonging to the authorities, every paper and document passing first through their hands for examination before being sent on board. The trade carried on between England, Holland, and Spain at the time when these nations were engaged in war was a singular one, but it was permitted by all 3 countries, because the products of each were urgently required by the others. It was kept within narrow limits, and there were frequent angry complaints exchanged between the English government and that of Holland, when either considered the other to be going beyond that limit. Geoffrey admitted to himself that he might again make an attempt to return to England, by taking passage as before in a ship bound for Italy, but he knew that Elizabeth was negotiating with Philip for peace, and thought he might as well await the result. He was indeed very happy at Cadiz, and shrank from the thought of leaving it. Stephen Bolderow soon became restless, and at his urgent request, Juan Mendez appointed him second mate on board one of his ships sailing for the West Indies, his intention being to make his escape if an opportunity offered. But if not, he preferred a life of activity to wandering aimlessly about the streets of Cadiz. He was greatly grieved to part from Geoffrey, and promised that, should he ever reach England, he would at once journey down to Hedingham and report his safety to his father and mother. "You will do very well here, Master Geoffrey," he said. "You are quite at home with all the Spaniards, and it will not be very long before you speak the language so well that, except for your name, none would take you for a foreigner. You have found work to do, and are really better off here than you would be starving and fighting in Holland. Besides," he said with a sly wink, "there are other attractions for you. Juan Mendez treats you as a son, and the señorita knows she owes everything to you. You might do worse than settle here for life. Like enough, you will see me back again in 6 months' time, for if I see no chance of slipping off and reaching one of the islands held by the buccaneers, I shall perforce return in the ship I go out in." At parting, Señor Mendez bestowed a bag containing 500 gold pieces upon Stephen Bolderow as reward for the service he had rendered him. Geoffrey missed him greatly. For 18 months they had been constantly together, and it was the sailor's companionship and cheerfulness that had lightened the first days of his captivity, and had it not been for his advice and support, he might now have been tugging at an oar in the Bey's corsair galley. Ever since they had been at Cadiz, he had daily spent an hour or two in his society, for when work was done they generally went for a walk together on the fortifications, and talked of England and discussed the possibility of escape. After his departure he was thrown more than before into the society of the merchant and his daughter. The feeling that Dolores had, when he first saw her, excited within him, had changed its character. She was now very pretty that she had recovered her life and spirits, and she made no secret of the deep feeling of gratitude she entertained towards him. One day, 3 months after Stephen's departure, Señor Mendez, when they were alone together, broached the subject on which his thoughts had been turned so much of late. "Friend Geoffrey," he said, "I think that I am not mistaken in supposing that you have an affection for Dolores. I have marked its growth, and although I would naturally have rather bestowed her upon a countryman, yet I feel you have a right to her as having saved her from the horrible fate that would undoubtedly have befallen her, and that it is not for me, to whom you have restored her, besides saving my own life, to offer any objection. As to her feelings, I have no doubt whatever. Were you of my own religion and race, such a match would afford me the greatest happiness. As it is, I regret it only because I feel that some day or other it will lead to a separation from me. It is natural that you should wish to return to your own country, and as this war cannot go on forever, doubtless in time some opportunity for doing so will arise. This I foresee and must submit to, but if there is peace, I shall be able occasionally to visit her in her home in England. I naturally hope that it will be long before I shall thus lose her. She is my only child, and I shall give her as her dower the half of my business, and you will join me as an equal partner. When the war is over, you can, if you wish, establish yourself in London, and thence carry on and enlarge the English and Dutch trade of our house. I may even myself settle there. I have not thought this over at present, nor is there any occasion to do so. I am a wealthy man, and there is no need for me to continue in business, and I am not sure when the time comes I shall not prefer to abandon my country rather than be separated from my daughter. At any rate, for the present, I offer you her hand and a share in my business." Geoffrey expressed in suitable terms the gratitude and delight he felt at the offer. It was contrary to Spanish notions that he should receive from Dolores in private any assurance that the proposal in which she was so largely concerned was one to which she consented willingly, but her father at once fetched her in and formally presented her to Geoffrey as his promised wife, and a month later the marriage was solemnized at the church of St. Dominic. End of Chapter 17. A Spanish Merchant. Recorded by Laura Brenner, close to Grettinger, Iowa, on May 1st, 2026. Chapter 18 of By England's Aid by G.A. Henty. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Ivry. The day after the capture of Breda, Sir Francis Vere sent for Lionel Vickars to his quarters. Prince Maurice and several of his principal officers were there, and the prince thanked him warmly for the share he had taken in the capture of the town. "Captain Harazer has told me," he said, "that the invention of the scheme that has ended so well is due as much to you as to him, that you accompanied him on the reconnoitering expedition, and shared in the dangers of the party in the barge. I trust Sir Francis Vere will appoint you to the first ensignacy vacant in his companies, but should there be likely to be any delay in this, I will gladly give you a commission in one of my own regiments." "I have forestalled your wish, Prince," Sir Francis said, "and have this morning given orders that his appointment shall be made out as ensign in one of my companies. But at present I do not intend him to join. I have been ordered by the Queen to send further aid to help the King of France against the League. I have already dispatched several companies to Brittany, and will now send 2 others. I would that my duties permitted me personally to take part in the enterprise, for the Battle of the Netherlands is at present being fought on the soil of France, but this is impossible. Several of my friends, however, volunteers and others, will journey with the 2 companies, being desirous of fighting under the banner of Henry of Navarre. Sir Ralph Pimpernel, who is married to a French Huguenot lady, and has connections at the French court, will lead them. I have spoken to him this morning, and he will gladly allow my young friend here to accompany him, and I think that it is the highest reward I can give him, to afford him thus an opportunity of seeing stirring service, for I doubt not that in a very short time a great battle will be fought. We know that Alva has sent 1,800 of the best cavalry of Flanders to aid the League, and he is sure to have given orders that they are to be back again as soon as possible. How do you like the prospect, Lionel?" Lionel warmly expressed his thanks to Sir Francis Vere for his kindness, and said that nothing would delight him more than to take part in such an enterprise. "I must do something at any rate to prove my gratitude for you in the capture of this city," Prince Maurice said, "and will send you presently 2 of the best horses of those we have found in the governor's stables, together with arms and armor suitable to your rank as an officer of Sir Francis Vere." Upon the following morning a party of 10 knights and gentlemen, including Lionel Vickars, rode to Bergen-op-Zoom. The 2 companies, which were drawn from the garrison of that town, had embarked the evening before in ships that had come from England, to transport them to France. Sir Ralph Pimpernel and his party at once went on board, and as soon as their horses were embarked, the sails were hoisted. 4 days' voyage took them to the mouth of the Seine, and they landed at Honfleur on the south bank of the river. There was a large number of ships in port, for the Protestant princes of Germany were, as well as England, sending aid to Henry of Navarre, and numbers of gentlemen and volunteers were flocking to his banners. For the moment, Henry IV represented in the eyes of Europe the Protestant cause. He was supported by the Huguenots of France, and by some of the Catholic noblemen and gentry. Against him were arrayed the greater portion of the Catholic nobles, the whole faction of the Guises, and the Holy League, supported by Philip of Spain. The party from Holland disembarked at midnight on the 9th of March. Hearing rumors that a battle was expected very shortly to take place, Sir Ralph Pimpernel started at once with his mounted party for Dreux, which town was being besieged by Henry, leaving the 2 companies of foot to press on at their best speed behind him. The distance to be ridden was about 60 miles, and late at night on the 10th they rode into a village 8 miles from Dreux. Here they heard that the Duke of Mayenne, who commanded the force of the League, was approaching the Seine at Mons, with an army of 10,000 foot and 4,000 horse. "We must mount at daybreak, gentlemen," Sir Ralph Pimpernel said, "or the forces of the League will get between us and the king. It is evident that we have but just arrived in time, and it is well we did not wait for our footmen." The next morning they mounted early and rode on to the royal camp near Dreux. Here Sir Ralph Pimpernel found Marshal Biron, a relation of his wife, who at once took him to the king. "You have just arrived in time, Sir Ralph," the king said when Marshal Biron introduced him, "for tomorrow, or at latest the day after, we are likely to try our strength with Mayenne. You will find many of your compatriots here. I can offer you but poor hospitality at present, but hope to entertain you rarely some day when the good city of Paris opens its gates to us." "Thanks, sire," Sir Ralph replied, "but we have come to fight, and not to feast." "I think I can promise you plenty of that at any rate," the king said. "You have 10 gentlemen with you, I hear, and also that there are 2 companies of foot from Holland now on their way up from Honfleur." "They landed at noon the day before yesterday, sire, and will probably be up tomorrow." "They will be heartily welcome, Sir Ralph. Since Parma has sent so large a force to help Mahon, it is but right that Holland, which is relieved of the presence of these troops, should lend me a helping hand." Quarters were found for the party in a village near the camp, for the force was badly provided with tents. The king's resources being at a very low ebb, he made the war indeed chiefly by the loans he received from England and Germany. The next day several bodies of troops were seen approaching the camp. A quarter of an hour later the trumpets blew. Officers rode about, ordering the tents to be leveled, and the troops to prepare to march. A messenger from Marshal Biron rode at full speed into the village, where many of the volunteers from England and Germany, besides the party of Sir Ralph Pimpernel, were lodged. "The Marshal bids me tell you, gentlemen, that the army moves at once. Marshal d'Aumont has fallen back from Ivry. Mahon is advancing. The siege will be abandoned at present, and we march towards Nonancourt, where we shall give battle tomorrow, if Mahon is disposed for it." The camps were struck, and the wagons loaded, and the army marched to Saint Andre, a village situated on an elevated plain commanding a view of all the approaches from the country between the Seine and Eure. "This is a fine field for a battle," Sir Ralph said, as the troops halted on the ground indicated by the camp marshals. "It is splendid ground for cavalry to act, and it is upon them the brunt of the fighting will fall. We are a little stronger in foot, for several companies from Honfleur, our own among them, have come up this morning, and I hear we muster 12,000, which is 1,000 more than they say Mahon has with him. But then he has 4,000 cavalry to our 3,000, and Parma's regiments of Spaniards, Walloons, and Italian veterans are far superior troops to Henry's bands of riders, who are mostly Huguenot noblemen and gentlemen, with their armed retainers. Tough and hardy men to fight as they have shown themselves on many a field, but without the discipline of Parma's troops. If Parma himself commanded yonder army, I should not feel confident of the result. But Mahon, although a skilful general, is slow and cautious, while Henry of Navarre is full of fire and energy, and brave almost to rashness. We are to muster under the command of the king himself. He will have 800 horse, formed into 6 squadrons, behind him, and upon these will, I fancy, come the chief shock of the battle. He will be covered on each side by the English and Swiss infantry, in all 4,000 strong. Marshal Biron will be on the right, with 5 troops of horse and 4 regiments of French infantry, while on the left will be the troops of d'Aumont, Montpensier, Biron, the younger d'Angoulême, and de Givry, supported in all by 2 regiments of French infantry, 1 of Swiss and 1 of German. The Marshal showed us the plan of the battle last night in his tent. It is well balanced and devised. It was late in the evening before the whole of the force had reached a position and the tents were erected. One of these had been placed at the disposal of Sir Ralph's party. Sir Ralph and 4 of his companions had been followed by their mounted squires, and these collected firewood and supplied the horses with forage from the sacks they carried slung from their saddles, while the knights and gentlemen themselves polished up their arms and armor, so as to make as brave a show as possible in the ranks of the king's cavalry. When they had eaten their supper, Lionel Vickars strolled through the camp, and was amused at the contrast represented by the various groups. The troops of cavalry of the French nobles were gaily attired, the tents of the officers large and commodious, with rich hangings and appointments. The sound of light-hearted laughter came from the groups round the campfires. Squires and pages moved about thickly, and it was evident that comfort, and indeed luxury, were considered by the commanders as essential, even upon a campaign. The encampments of the Germans, Swiss, and English infantry were of far humbler design. The tents of the officers were few in number, and of the simplest form and make. A considerable portion of the English infantry had been drawn from Holland, for the little army there was still the only body of trained troops at Elizabeth's disposal. The Swiss and Germans were, for the most part, mercenaries. Some had been raised at the expense of the Protestant princes. Others were paid from the sum supplied from England. The greater portion of the men were hardy veterans, who had fought under many banners, and cared but little for the cause in which they were fighting, provided they obtained their pay regularly, and that the rations were abundant and of good quality. The French infantry regiments contained men influenced by a variety of motives. Some were professional soldiers who had fought in many a field during the long wars that had for so many years agitated France. Others were the retainers of nobles who had thrown in their cause with Henry, while others again were Huguenot peasants who were fighting, not for pay, but in the cause of their religion. The cavalry were for the most part composed of men of good family, relations and connections, or the superior vassals of the nobles who commanded or officered them. The king's own squadrons were chiefly composed of Huguenot gentlemen and their mounted retainers, but with these rode many foreign volunteers, like Sir Ralph Pimpernel's party, attracted to Henry's banner either from a desire to aid the Protestant cause or to gain military knowledge and fame under so brave and able a monarch, or simply from the love of excitement and military order. The camp of this main body of cavalry, or battalia, as the body on whom the commander of our army chiefly relied for victory was called, was comparatively still and silent. The Huguenot gentlemen, after the long years of persecution to which those of their religion had been exposed, were, for the most part, poor. Their appointments were simple, and they fought for conscience' sake, and went into battle with the stern enthusiasm that afterwards animated Cromwell's Ironsides. It was not long before the camp quieted down, for the march had been a long one, and they would be on their feet by daybreak. The king himself, attended by Marshals d'Aumont and Biron, had gone through the whole extent of the camp, seen that all was in order, and that the troops had everywhere received their rations, and that the officers were acquainted with the orders for the morrow. He stayed a short time in the camp of each regiment and troop, saying a few words of encouragement to the soldiers, and laughing and joking with the officers. He paused a short time and chatted with Sir Ralph Pimpernel, who at his request introduced each of his companions to him. Lionel looked with interest and admiration at the man who was regarded as the champion of Protestantism against Popery, and who combined in himself a remarkable mixture of qualities seldom found existing in one person. He was brave to excess and apparently reckless in action, and yet astute, prudent, and calculating in council, with a manner frank, open, and winning. He was yet able to match the craftiest opponents at their own weapons of scheming and duplicity. The idol of the Huguenots of France, he was ready to purchase the crown of France at the price of accepting the Catholic doctrines, for he saw that it was hopeless for him, in the long run, to maintain himself against the hostility of almost all the great nobles of France, backed by the great proportion of the people, and aided by the Pope and the Catholic powers, so long as he remained a Protestant. This change of creed was scarcely even foreseen by those who followed him, and it was the apparent hopelessness of his cause, and the gallantry with which he maintained it, that attracted the admiration of Europe. Henry's capital was at the time garrisoned by the troops of the Pope in Spain. The great nobles of France, who had long maintained a sort of semi-independence of the crown, were all against him, and were calculating on founding independent kingdoms. He himself was excommunicated. The League were masters of almost the whole of France, and were well supplied with funds by the Pope and the Catholic powers, while Henry was entirely dependent for money upon what he could borrow from Queen Elizabeth and the States of Holland. But no one who listened to the merry laugh of the king as he chatted with the little group of English gentlemen would have thought that he was engaged in a desperate and well-nigh hopeless struggle, and that the following day was to be a decisive one as to his future fortunes. "Well, gentlemen," he said as he turned his horse to ride away, "I must ask you to lie down as soon as possible. As long as the officers are awake and talking, the men cannot sleep, and I want all to have a good night's rest. The enemy's camp is close at hand, and the battle is sure to take place at early dawn." As the same orders were given everywhere, the camp was quiet early, and before daylight the troops were called under arms, and ranged in the order appointed for them to fight in. The army of the League was astir in equally good time. In its center was the battalia, composed of 600 splendid cavalry, all noblemen of France, supported by a column of 300 Swiss and 2,000 French infantry. On the left were 600 French cuirassiers, and 1,800 troops of Parma, commanded by Count Egmont. They were supported by 6 regiments of French and Lorrainers, and 2,000 Germans. The right wing was composed of 3 regiments of Spanish lancers, 2 troops of Germans, 400 cuirassiers, and 4 regiments of infantry. When the sun rose and lighted upon the contending armies, the difference between their appearance was very marked. That of the League was gay with the gilded armor, waving plumes, and silken scarves of the French nobles, whose banners floated brightly in the air, while the Walloons and Flemish rivaled their French comrades in the splendor of their appointments. In the opposite ranks there was neither gaiety nor show. The Huguenot nobles and the gentlemen, who had for so many years been fighting for life and religion, were clad in armor dented in 100 battlefields, while the nobles of the League were confident of victory, and loudly demanding to be led against the foe. Henry of Navarre and his soldiers were kneeling, praying to the god of battles to enable them to bear themselves well in the coming fight. Henry of Navarre wore on his helmet a snow-white plume, which he ordered his troops to keep in view, and to follow wherever they should see it waving, in case his banner went down. Artillery still played but a small part in battles on the field, and there were but 12 pieces on the ground, equally divided between the two armies. These opened the battle, and Count Egmont, whose cavalry had suffered from the fire of the Huguenot cannon, ordered a charge, and the splendid cavalry of Parma swept down upon the right wing of Henry. The cavalry, under Marshal Biron, were unable to withstand the shock, and were swept before them, and Egmont rode on right up to the guns and sabred the artillerymen. Almost at the same moment, the German riders, under Eric of Brunswick, the Spanish and French lancers, charged down upon the center of the royal army. The rout of the right wing shook the cavalry in the center. They wavered, and the infantry on their flanks fell back, but the king and his officers rode among them, shouting and entreating them to stand firm. The ground in their front was soft, and checked the impetuosity of the charge of the Leaguers, and, by the time they reached the ranks of the Huguenots, they were broken and disordered, and could make no impression whatever upon them. As soon as the charge was repulsed, Henry set his troops in motion, and the battalion charged down upon the disordered cavalry of the League. The lancers and cuirassiers were borne down by the impetuosity of the charge, and Marshal Biron, rallying his troops, followed the king's white plume into the heart of the battle. Egmont brought up the cavalry of Flanders to the scene, and was charging at their head when he fell dead with a musket ball through the heart. Brunswick went down in the fight, and the shattered German and Walloon horse were completely overthrown and cut to pieces by the furious charges of the Huguenot cavalry. At one time the victorious onset was checked by the disappearance of the king's snow-white plumes, and a report ran through the army that the king was killed. They wavered irresolutely. The enemy, regaining courage from the cessation of their attacks, were again advancing, when the king reappeared bareheaded and covered with dust and blood, but entirely unhurt. He addressed a few cheerful words to his soldiers, and again led a charge. It was irresistible. The enemy broke and fled in the wildest confusion, hotly pursued by the royalist cavalry, while the infantry of the League, who had so far taken no part whatever in the battle, were seized with a panic, threw away their arms, and sought refuge in the woods in their rear. Thus the battle was decided only by the cavalry, the infantry taking no part in the fight on either side. 800 of the Leaguers either fell on the battlefield or were drowned in crossing the river in their rear. The loss of the Royalists was but 1/4 that number. Had the king pushed forward upon Paris immediately after the attack, the city would probably have surrendered without a blow, and the Huguenot leaders urged his course upon him. Biron and the other Catholics, however, argued that it was better to undertake a regular siege, and the king yielded to this advice, although the bolder course would have been far more in accordance with his own disposition. He was probably influenced by a variety of motives. In the first place, his Swiss mercenaries were in a mutinous condition, and refused to advance a single foot unless they received their arrears of pay, and this Henry, whose chests were entirely empty, had no means of providing. In the second place, he was at the time secretly in negotiation with the Pope for his conversion, and may have feared to give so heavy a blow to the Catholic cause as would have been effected by the capture of Paris, following closely after the victory of Ivry. At any rate, he determined upon a regular siege. Moving forward, he seized the towns of Lagny on the Marne, and Corbeil on the Seine, thus entirely cutting off the food supply of Paris. Lionel Vickars had borne his part in the charges of the Huguenot cavalry, but as the company to which he belonged was in the rear of the battalion, he had no personal encounters with the enemy. After the advance towards Paris, the duties of the cavalry consisted entirely in scouting the country, sweeping in provisions for their own army, and preventing supplies from entering Paris. No siege operations were undertaken, the king relying upon famine alone to reduce the city. Its population at the time the siege commenced was estimated at 400,000, and the supply of provisions to be sufficient for a month. It was calculated, therefore, that before the League could bring up another army to its relief, it must fall by famine. But no allowance had been made for the religious enthusiasm and devotion to the cause of the League that animated the population of Paris. Its governor, the Duke of Nemours, brother of Maine, aided by the 3 Spanish delegates, the Cardinal Gaetano, and by an army of priests and monks, sustained the spirits of the population, and though the people starved by thousands, the city resisted until towards the end of August. In that month, the army of the League, united with 12,000 foot and 3,000 horse from the Netherlands, under Parma himself, advanced to its assistance, while Maurice of Holland, with a small body of Dutch troops and reinforcements from England, had strengthened the army of the king. The numbers of the 2 armies were not unequal. Many of the French nobles had rallied round Henry after his victory, and of his cavalry 4,000 were nobles, and the retainers who served at their own expense, and were eager for the battle. Parma himself had doubts as to the result of the conflict. He could rely upon the troops he himself had brought, but had no confidence in those of the League, and when Henry sent him a formal challenge to a general engagement, Parma replied that it was his custom to refuse a combat when a refusal seemed advantageous for himself, and to offer battle whenever it suited his purpose to fight. For 7 days the 2 armies, each some 25,000 strong, lay within a mile or 2 of each other. Then the splendid cavalry of Parma moved out in order of battle, with banners flying, and the pennons of the lances fluttering in the wind. The king was delighted when he saw that the enemy were at last advancing to the fight. He put his troops at once under arms, but waited until the plan of the enemy's battle developed itself before making his dispositions. But while the imposing array of the cavalry was attracting the king's attention, Parma moved off with the main body of his army, threw a division across the river on a pontoon bridge, and attacked Lagny on both sides. When Lagny was first occupied, some of Sir Ralph Pimpernel's party were appointed to take up their quarters there. Half a company of the English, who had come with them from Holland, were also stationed in the town, the garrison being altogether 1,200 strong. Lionel's horse had received a bullet wound at Ivry, and although it carried him for the next day or 2, it was evident that it needed rest and attention, and would be unfit to carry his rider for some time. Lionel had no liking for the work of driving off the cattle of the unfortunate landowners and peasants, however necessary it might be to keep the army supplied with food, and was glad of the excuse that his wounded horse afforded him for remaining quietly in the town when his comrades rode out with a troop of cavalry stationed there. It happened that the officer in command of the little body of English infantry was taken ill with fever, and Sir Ralph Pimpernel requested Lionel to take his place. This he was glad to do, as he was more at home at infantry work than with cavalry. The time went slowly, but Lionel, who had comfortable quarters in the house of a citizen, did not find it long. The burgher's family consisted of his wife and 2 daughters, and these congratulated themselves greatly upon having an officer quartered upon them, who not only acted as a protection to them against the insolence of the rough soldiery, but was courteous and pleasant in his manner, and tried in every way to show that he regarded himself as a guest and not a master. After the first week's stay, he requested that instead of having his meals served to him in a room apart, he might take them with the family. The girls were about Lionel's age, and after the first restraint wore off, he became great friends with them, and although at first he had difficulty in making himself understood, he rapidly picked up a little French, the girls acting as his teachers. "What do you English do here?" the eldest of them asked him, when 6 weeks after his arrival they were able to converse fairly in a mixture of French and Spanish. "Why do you not leave us French people to fight out our quarrels by ourselves?" "I should put it the other way," Lionel laughed. "Why don't you French people fight out your quarrels among yourselves instead of calling in foreigners to help you? It is because the Guises and the League have called in the Spaniards to fight on the Catholic side that the English and Dutch have come to help the Huguenots. We are fighting the battle of our own religion here, not the battle of Henry of Navarre." "I hate these wars of religion," the girl said. "Why can we not all worship in our own way?" "Ah, that is what we Protestants want to know, Mademoiselle Claire. But it is just what your people won't allow. Did you not massacre the Protestants in France on the eve of St. Bartholomew? And have not the Spaniards been for the last 20 years trying to stamp out with fire and sword the new religion in the Low Countries? We only want to be left alone." "But your Queen of England kills the Catholics." "Not at all," Lionel said warmly. "That is only one of the stories they spread to excuse their own doings. It is true that Catholics in England have been put to death, and so have people of the sect that call themselves Anabaptists. But this has been because they have been engaged in plots against the Queen, and not because of their religion. The Catholics of England, for the most part, joined as heartily as the Protestants in the preparations for the defence of England in the time of the Armada. For my part, I cannot understand why people should quarrel with each other because they worship God in different ways. It is all very bad, I am sure, the girl said. France has been torn to pieces by these religious wars for years and years. It is dreadful to think what they must be suffering in Paris now. Then why don't they open their gates to King Henry, instead of starving themselves at the orders of the legate of the Pope and the agent of Philip of Spain? I could understand if there was another French prince whom they wanted as king instead of Henry of Navarre. We fought for years in England as to whether we should have a king from the House of York or the House of Lancaster. But when it comes to choosing between a king of your own race and a king named for you by Philip of Spain, I can't understand it. Never mind, Master Vickars. You know what you are fighting for, don't you? I do. I am fighting here to aid England. Parma is bringing all his troops to aid the Guises here, and while they are away, the Dutch will take town after town, and will make themselves so strong that when Parma goes back, he will find the nut harder than ever to crack. How long will Paris hold out, think you, Master Vickars? They say that provisions are well nigh spent. Judging from the way in which the Dutch towns held out for weeks and weeks after it seemed all supplies were exhausted, I should say that if the people of Paris are as ready to suffer rather than yield as were the Dutch burghers, they may hold on for a long time yet. It is certain that no provisions can come to them as long as we hold possession of this town, and so block the river. But if the armies of Parma and the League come, they may drive you away, Master Vickars. It is quite possible, mademoiselle. We do not pretend to be invincible, but I think there will be some tough fighting first. As the weeks went on, Lionel Vickars came to be on very intimate terms with the family. The two maidservants shared in the general liking for the young officer. He gave no more trouble than if he were one of the family, and on one or two occasions, when the disturbances were caused by the ill conduct of the miscellaneous bands which constituted the garrison, he brought his half-company of English soldiers at once into the house, and by his resolute attitude prevented the marauders from entering. When Parma's army approached, Sir Ralph Pimpernel, with the cavalry, joined the king, but Lionel shared in the disappointment felt by all the infantry of the garrison of Lagny that they could take no share in the great battle that was expected. Their excitement rose high while the armies lay watching each other. From the position of the town down by the river, neither army was visible from its walls, and they only learned when occasional messengers rode in how matters were going on. One morning Lionel was awoke by a loud knocking at his door. "What is it?" he shouted as he sat up in bed. "It is I, Timothy Short, Master Vickars. The sergeant has sent me to wake you in all haste. The Spaniards have stolen a march upon us. They have thrown a bridge across the river somewhere in the night, and most all their army stands between us and the king, while a division are preparing to besiege the town on the other side." Lionel was hastily throwing on his clothes and arming himself while the man was speaking. "Tell the sergeant," he said, "to get the men under arms. I will be with him in a few minutes." When Lionel went out, he found that the household was already astir. "Do not go out fasting," his host said. "Take a cup of wine and some food before you start. You may be some time before you get an opportunity of eating again, if what they say is true." "Thank you heartily," Lionel replied as he sat down to the table on which some food had already been placed. "It is always better to fight full than fasting." "Hark you," the burgoyne said in his ear. "If things go badly with you, make your way here. I have a snug hiding place, and I shall take refuge there with my family if the Spaniards capture the town. I have heard of their doings in Holland, and that when they capture a town they spare neither age nor sex, and slay Catholics as well as Protestants. Therefore I shall take refuge till matters have quieted down and order is restored. I shall set to work at once to carry my valuables there, and a goodly store of provisions. My warehouse man will remain in charge above. He is faithful and can be trusted. He will tell the Spaniards that I am a good Catholic, and lead them to believe that I fled with my family before the Huguenots entered the town." "Thank you greatly," Lionel replied. "Should the need arise, I will take advantage of your kind offer, but it should not do so. We have 1,200 men here, and half that number of citizens have kept the Spaniards at bay for months before a town no stronger than this in Holland. We ought to be able to defend ourselves here for weeks, and the king will assuredly come to our relief in 2 or 3 days at the outside." Upon Lionel sallying out, he found the utmost confusion and disorder reigning. The commandant was hurriedly assigning to the various companies composing the garrison their places upon the walls. Many of the soldiers were exclaiming that they had been betrayed, and that it were best to make terms with the Spaniards at once. The difference between the air of quiet resolution that marked the conduct of the people and troops at Sluys, and the excitement manifested here, struck Lionel unpleasantly. The citizens all remained in their houses, afraid lest the exultation they felt at the prospect of deliverance would be so marked as to enrage the soldiery. Lionel's own company was standing quietly and in good order in the marketplace, and as soon as he received orders as to the point that he should occupy on the walls, Lionel marched them away. In half an hour the Spanish batteries, which had been erected during the night, opened fire upon several points of the walls. The town was ill provided with artillery, and the answer was feeble, and before evening several breaches had been effected, 2 of the gates blown in, and the Spaniards advancing to the assault. Lionel and his company, with one composed of Huguenot gentlemen and their retainers, and another of Germans, defended the gate at which they were posted with great bravery, and succeeded in repulsing the attacks of the Spaniards time after time. The latter pressed forward in heavy columns, only to recoil broken and shattered from the archway, which was filled high with their dead. The defenders had just succeeded in repulsing the last of these attacks, when some soldiers ran by shouting, "All is lost! The Spaniards have entered the town at 3 points!" The German company at once disbanded and scattered. The Huguenot noble said to Lionel, "I fear that the news is true. Listen to the shouts and cries in the town behind us. I will march with my men and see if there is any chance of beating back the Spaniards. If not, it were best to lay down our arms and ask for quarter. Will you try to hold this gate until I return?" "I will do so," Lionel said, "but I have only about 30 men left, and if the Spaniards come on again, we cannot hope to repulse them." "If I am not back in 10 minutes, it will be because all is lost," the Huguenot said. "You had then best save yourself as you can." But long before the 10 minutes passed, crowds of fugitives ran past, and Lionel learned that great numbers of the enemy had entered, and that they were refusing quarter and slaying all they met. "It is useless to stay here longer to be massacred," Lionel said to his men. "I should advise you to take refuge in the churches, leaving your arms behind you as you enter. It is evident that further resistance is useless, and would only cost us our lives. The Spaniards are 20 to 1, and it is evident that all hope of resistance is at an end." The men were only too glad to accept the advice, and, throwing down their arms, hurried away. Lionel sheathed his sword, and with the greatest difficulty made his way through the scene of wild confusion to the house where he had lodged. The doors of most of the houses were fast closed, and the inhabitants were hurling down missiles of all kinds from the upper windows upon their late masters. The triumphant shouts of the Spaniards rose loud in the air, mingled with despairing cries and the crack of firearms. Lionel had several narrow escapes from the missiles thrown down from the windows and roofs, but reached the house of the merchant safely. The door was half open. "Thanks be to heaven that you have come. I had well nigh given you up, and in another minute should have closed the door. The women are all below, but I waited until the last minute for you." Barring the door, Lionel's host led the way downstairs to a great cellar, which served as a warehouse and extended under the whole house. He made his way through the boxes and bales to the darkest corner of the great cellar. Here he pulled up a flag and showed another narrow stair, at the bottom of which a torch was burning. Bidding Lionel descend, he followed him, lowered the flag behind him, and then led the way along a narrow passage, at the end of which was a door. Opening it, Lionel found himself in an arched chamber. 2 torches were burning, and the merchant's wife and daughters, and the 2 female domestics were assembled. There was a general exclamation of gladness as Lionel entered. "We have been greatly alarmed," the mercer's wife said, "lest you should not be able to gain the house, Master Vickars, for we heard that the Spaniards are broken in at several points." "It was fortunately at the other end of the town to that at which I was stationed," Lionel said, "and I was just in time. You have a grand hiding-place here. It looks like the crypt of a church." "That is just what it is," the mercer said. "It was the church of a monastery that stood here 100 years ago. The monks then moved into a grander place in Paris, and the monastery and the church, which adjoined our house, were pulled down and the houses erected upon the site. My grandfather, knowing of the existence of the crypt, thought that it might afford a rare hiding-place in case of danger, and had the passage driven from his cellar into it. Its existence could never be suspected, for as our cellar extends over the whole of our house, as can be easily seen, none would suspect that there was a hiding-place without our walls. There are 3 or 4 chambers as large as this. One of them is stored with all my choicest silks and velvets. and another will serve as a chamber for you and me. I have enough provisions for a couple of months, and even should they burn the house down, we are safe enough here. End of Chapter 18. Ivry. Recorded by Laura Brenner, close to Grettinger, Iowa, on May 7th, 2026. Chapter 19 of By England's Aid by G.A. Henty. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Steenwyk. 3 days passed, and then a slight noise was heard as of a trap door being raised. Lionel drew his sword. "It is my servant, no doubt," the merchant said. "He promised to come down and tell me how things went as soon as he could get an opportunity to come down unobserved. We should hear more noise if it were the Spaniards." Taking a light, he went along the passage, and returned immediately afterwards, followed by his man. The latter had his head bound up, and carried his arm in a sling. An exclamation of pity broke from the ladies. "You are badly hurt, Jacques. What has happened?" "It is well it is no worse, mistress," he replied. "The Spaniards are fiends, and behaved as if they were sacking a city of Dutch Huguenots instead of entering a town inhabited by friends. For an hour or two they cut and slashed, pillaged and robbed. They came rushing into the shop, and before I could say a word, one ran me through the shoulder, another laid my head open. It was an hour or two before I came to my senses. I found the house turned topsy-turvy. Everything worth taking had gone, and what was not taken was damaged. I tied up my head and arm as best I could, and then sat quiet in a corner until the din outside began to subside. The officers did their best, I hear, and at last got the men into order. Numbers of the townsfolk had been killed, and every one of the garrison was butchered. I tell you, mistress, it is better to have 10 Huguenot armies in possession, one after another, than one Spanish force, though the latter come as friends and co-religionists. Well, as soon as things quieted down, the soldiers were divided among the houses of the townsfolk, and we have a sergeant and 10 men quartered above. But half an hour ago they were called away on some duty, and I took the opportunity to steal down here." "Have you told them that we were away, Jacques?" "No, monsieur. No one has asked me about it. They saw by the pictures and shrines that you were good Catholics, and after the first outburst they left things alone. But if it is not too dreary for the ladies here, I should advise you to wait for a time and see how things go before you show yourselves." "That is my opinion too, Jacques. We can wait here for another 2 months if need be. Doubtless, unless the Huguenots show signs of an intention to attack the town, only a small garrison will be left here, and it may be that those in our house will be withdrawn." "Do you think it will be possible for me to make my escape, Jacques?" Lionel asked. "I should think so, sir. Ever since the Spaniards entered the town, boats with provisions for Paris have been coming along in great numbers. From what I hear the soldiers say, there is no chance of a battle at present, for the Huguenot army has drawn off to a distance, seeing that Paris is revictualled, and that there is no chance of taking it. They say that numbers of the French lords with the Huguenot army have drawn off and are making for their homes. At any rate, there is no fear of an attack here, and the gates stand open all day. Numbers of the townsfolk have been to Paris to see friends there, and I should say that if you had a disguise, you could pass out easily enough." The question was discussed for some time. Lionel was very anxious to rejoin the army, and it was finally settled that Jacques should, the next night, bring him down a suit of his own clothes, and the first time the soldiers were all away, should fetch him out, accompany him through the gates of the town, and act as his guide as far as he could. The next night Lionel received the clothes. 2 days later Jacques came down early in the morning to say that the soldiers above had just gone out on duty. Lionel at once assumed his disguise, and with the heartiest thanks for the great service they had rendered him, took his leave of the kind merchant and his family. Jacques was charged to accompany him as far as possible, and to set him well on his way towards the Huguenot army, for Lionel's small knowledge of French would be detected by the first person who accosted him. On going out into the street, Lionel found that there were many peasants who came in to sell fowls, eggs, and vegetables in the town, and he and Jacques passed without a question through the gates. Jacques had, the evening before, ascertained from the soldiers the position of Parma's army. A long detour had to be made, and it was 2 days before they came in sight of the tents of Henry's camp. They had observed the greatest precautions on their way, and had only once fallen in with a troop of Parma's cavalry. These had asked no questions, supposing that Jacques and his companion were making their way from Paris to visit their friends after the siege, there being nothing in their attire to attract attention, still less suspicion. The peasants they met on their way eagerly demanded news from Paris, but Jacques easily satisfied them by saying that they had had a terrible time, and that many had died of hunger, but that now the river was open again, better times had come. Within a couple of miles of the army, Jacques said goodbye to Lionel, who would have rewarded him handsomely for his guidance, but Jacques would not accept money. "You are the master's guest," he said, "and you saved his house from plunder when your people were in possession. He and my mistress would never forgive me if I took money from you. I am well content in having been able to assist so kind a young gentleman." When Lionel arrived at the camp, he soon found his way to Sir Ralph Pimpernel's tent, where he was received as one from the dead. There was no difficulty in providing himself again with armor and arms, for these there were in abundance, the spoils of Ivry in the camp. When he was reclothed and rearmed, Sir Ralph took him to the king's tent, and from him Henry learned for the first time the circumstances that had attended the capture of Lagny. "And so they put the whole garrison to the sword," the king said with indignation. "I will make any Spaniards that fall in my hands pay dearly for it." Henry had indeed been completely outgeneraled by his opponent. Though he had been waiting with his army for a pitched battle, Parma had invested Lagny, and there were no means of relieving it except by crossing the river in the face of the whole army of the enemy, an enterprise impossible of execution. As soon as Lagny had fallen, provisions and ammunition were at once poured into Paris, 2,000 boatloads arriving in a single day. King Henry's army immediately fell to pieces. The cavalry, having neither food nor forage, rode off by hundreds every day, and in a week but 2,000 out of his 6,000 horse remained with him. The infantry, also, seeing now no hope of receiving their arrears of pay, disbanded in large numbers, and after an unsuccessful attempt to carry Paris by a night attack, the king fell back with the remnant of his force. Corbeil was assaulted and captured by Parma, and the two great rivers of Paris were now open. If Parma could have remained with his army in France, the cause of Henry of Navarre would have been lost, but sickness was making ravages among his troops. Dissensions broke out between the Spaniards, Italians, and the Netherlanders of his army, and their French allies, who hated the foreigners, though they had come to their assistance. Lastly, his presence was urgently required in the Netherlands, where his work was as far from being done as ever. Therefore, to the dismay of the Leaguers, he started early in November on his march back. No sooner did he retire than the king took the field again, recaptured Lagny and Corbeil, and recommenced the siege of Paris, while his cavalry hung upon the rear and flanks of Parma's army, and harassed him continually, until they crossed the frontier, where the Duke found that affairs had not improved during his absence. Lionel had obtained permission to accompany the force which captured Lagny, and as soon as they entered the town, hurried to the mercer's house. He found Jacques in possession, and learned that the family had weeks before left the crypt, and reoccupied the house, but had again taken refuge there when the Huguenots attacked the town. Lionel at once went below, and was received with delight. He was now able to repay to some extent the obligations he had received from them, by protecting them from all interference by the new captors of the town, from whom the majority of the citizens received harsh treatment for the part they had taken in attacking the garrison when the Spaniards first entered. Prince Maurice's visit to the camp of Henry had been but a short one, and as soon as Parma had effected the relief of Paris, there was no longer a chance of a great battle being fought. He returned to Holland, followed after the capture of Lagny by Sir Ralph Pimpernel and the few survivors of his party, who were all heartily weary of a long period of inaction that had followed the victory of Ivry. They found that during their absence there had been little doing in the Netherlands, save that Sir Francis Vere, with a small body of English infantry and cavalry, had stormed some formidable works the Spaniards had thrown up to prevent relief being given to Recklinghausen, which they were besieging. He effected the relief of the town and drove off the besiegers. He then attacked and captured a fort on the bank of the Rhine, opposite the town of Wesel. At the end of the year 1590, there were, including the garrisons, some 8,000 English infantry and cavalry in Holland, and the year that followed was to see a great change in the nature of the war. The efforts of Prince Maurice to improve his army were to bear effect, and with the assistance of his English allies, he was to commence an active offensive war, to astonish his foes by the rapidity with which he maneuvered the new fighting machine he had created, and to commence a new departure in the tactics of war. In May, he took the field, requesting Vere to cooperate with him in the siege of Zutphen, but Sir Francis determined in the first place to capture on his own account the Zutphen forts, on the opposite side of the river, since these had been lost by the treachery of Roland York. He dressed up a score of soldiers, some as peasants, others as countrywomen, and provided them with a basket of eggs and other provisions. At daybreak, these went down by twos and threes to the Zutphen ferry, as if waiting to be taken across to the town, and while waiting for the boat to come across for them, they sat down near the gate of the fort. A few minutes later, a party of English cavalry were seen riding rapidly towards the fort. The pretended country people sprang to their feet, and with cries of alarm ran towards it for shelter. The gates were thrown open to allow them to enter. As they ran in, they drew out the arms concealed under their clothes, and overpowered the guard. The cavalry dashed up and entered the gate before the garrison could assemble, and the fort was captured. Vere at once began to throw up his batteries for the attack upon the town across the river, and the prince invested the city on the other side. So diligently did the besiegers work that before a week had passed after the surprise of the forts, the batteries were completed, 32 guns placed in position, and the garrison, seeing there was no hope of relief, surrendered. On the very day of taking possession of the town, the Allies, leaving a garrison there, marched against Deventer, 7 miles down the river, and within 5 days had invested the place and opened their batteries upon the weakest part of the town. A breach was effected, and a storm was ordered. A dispute arose between the English, Scotch, and Dutch troops as to who should have the honor of leading the assault. Prince Maurice decided in favor of the English, in order that they might have an opportunity of wiping out the stigma on the national honor caused by the betrayal of Deventer by the traitor Sir William Stanley. To reach the breach, it was necessary to cross a piece of water called the Haven. Sir Francis Vere led the English across the bridge of boats which had been thrown over the water, but the bridge was too short. Some of the troops sprang over and pushed boldly for the breach. Others were pushed over and drowned. Many of those behind stripped off their armor and swam across the Haven, supported by some Dutch troops who had been told off to follow the assaulting party. But at the breach they were met by Vanderburg, the governor, with 7 companies of soldiers, and these fought so courageously that the assailants were unable to win their way up the breach, and fell back at last with a loss of 225 men, killed and wounded. While the assault was going on, the artillery of the besiegers continued to play upon other parts of the town, and effect great damage. On the following night, the garrison endeavored to capture the bridge across the Haven, but were repulsed with loss, and in the morning the place surrendered. The success of the patriots was due in no slight degree to the fact that Parma, with the greatest part of his army, was again absent in France, and the besieged towns had therefore no hope of assistance from without. The Estates now determined to seize the opportunity of capturing the towns held by the Spaniards in Friesland. The 3 principal towns in possession of the Spaniards were Groningen, Steenwyk, and Coevorden. After capturing several less important places and forts, Prince Maurice advanced against Steenwyk, but just as he was about to commence the siege, he received pressing letters from the States to hurry south, as Parma was marching with his whole army to capture the fort of Nodzenburg, which had been raised in the previous autumn as a preparation for the siege of the important city of Nijmegen. The Duke of Parma considered that he had ample time to reduce Nodzenburg before Prince Maurice could return to its assistance. 2 great rivers barred the prince's return, and he would have to traverse the dangerous district called the Foul Meadow, and the great quagmire known as the Rovanian Morass. But Prince Maurice had now an opportunity of showing the excellence of his army he had raised and trained. He received the news of Parma's advance on the 15th of July. 2 days later he was on the march south, and in 5 days had thrown bridges of boats across the 2 rivers, had crossed morass and swamp, and appeared in front of the Spanish army. One assault had already been delivered by the Spaniards against Nodzenburg, but this had been repulsed with heavy loss. As soon as the patriot army approached the neighborhood, Parma's cavalry went out to drive in its skirmishers. Vere at once proposed to Prince Maurice to inflict a sharp blow upon the enemy, and with the approval of the prince, marched with 1,200 foot and 500 horse along the dike which ran across the Low Country. Marching to a spot where a bridge crossed a narrow river, he placed half his infantry in ambush there, and the other half a quarter of a mile farther back. 200 light cavalry were sent forward to beat up the enemy's outposts, and then retreat. The rest of the cavalry were posted in the rear of the infantry. Another dike ran nearly parallel with the first, falling into it at some distance in the rear of Vere's position, and here Prince Maurice stationed himself with a body of horse and foot to cover Vere's retreat, should he be obliged to fall back. About noon the light cavalry skirmished with the enemy and fell back, but were not followed. About half an hour later, the scouts brought word that the Spaniards were at hand. Suddenly, and without orders, 800 of Maurice's cavalry galloped off to meet the enemy, but they soon came back again at full speed, with a strong force of Spanish cavalry in pursuit. Vere's infantry at once sallied out from the ambush among the trees, poured their fire into the enemy, and charged him with their pikes. The Spaniards turned to fly, when Vere's cavalry charged them furiously and drove them back in a headlong rout to their own camp, taking a great number of prisoners, among them many officers of rank, and 500 horse. Parma, finding himself thus suddenly in face of a superior army, with a rapid river in his rear, fell back across the Val, and then proceeded to Spade to recruit his shattered health, leaving Verdugo, an experienced officer, in command. Instead of proceeding to besiege Nijmegen, Maurice marched away as suddenly and as quickly as before, and captured Holst, on the borders of Zeeland and Brabant, a dozen miles only from Antwerp, and then, turning again, was, in 3 days, back at Nijmegen, and had placed 68 pieces of artillery in position. He opened fire on the 20th of October, and the next day the important city of Nijmegen surrendered. This series of brilliant successes greatly raised the spirits of the Netherlanders, and proportionately depressed those of the Spaniards and their adherents. Parma himself was ill from annoyance and disappointment. The army with which he might have completed the conquest of the Netherlands had, in opposition to his entreaties and prayers, been frittered away by Philip's orders in useless expeditions in France, while the young and active generals of the Dutch and English armies were snatching town after town from his grasp, and consolidating the Netherlands, so recently broken up by Spanish strongholds, into a compact body whose increasing wealth and importance rendered it every day a more formidable opponent. It is true that Parma had saved first Paris and afterwards Rouen from the League, but it was at the cost of losing Philip's hold over the most important outpost of the Spanish dominions. In the following spring, Parma was again forced to march into France with 20,000 men, and Maurice, as soon as the force started, prepared to take advantage of his absence. With 6,000 foot and 2,000 horse, he again appeared at the end of May before Steenwyk. This town was the key to the province of Drenthe, and one of the safeguards of Friesland. It was considered one of the strongest fortresses of its time. Its garrison consisted of 16 companies of foot and some cavalry, and 1,200 Walloon infantry, commanded by Louis, the youngest of the Counts de Berg, a brave lad of 18 years of age. In this siege, for the first time, the spade was used by the soldiers in the field. Hitherto the work had been considered derogatory to troops, and peasants and miners had been engaged for this work. But Prince Maurice had taught his soldiers that their duty was to work as well as fight, and they now proved the value of his teaching. The besieged made several successful sorties, and Sir Francis Vere had been severely wounded in the leg. The cannonade effected but little damage on the strong walls, but the soldiers, working night and day, drove mines under 2 of the principal bastions, and constructed 2 great chambers there. These were charged, one with 5,000 pounds of powder, the other with half that quantity. On the 3rd of July, the mines were sprung. The bastion of the east gate was blown to pieces, and the other bastion greatly injured, but many of the Dutch troops standing ready for the assault were also killed by the explosion. The storming parties, however, rushed forward, and the 2 bastions were captured. This left the town at the mercy of the besiegers. The next day the garrison surrendered, and were permitted to march away. 350 had been killed, among them young Count Louis Vanderburg, and 200 had been left behind, severely wounded, in the town. Between 500 and 600 of the besiegers were killed during the course of the siege. The very day after the surrender of Steenwyk, Maurice marched away and laid siege to Coevorden. This city, which had been most strongly fortified, lay between 2 great swamps, between which there was a passage of about half a mile in width. Another of the Vanderburgs, Count Frederick, commanded the garrison of 1,000 veterans. Verdugo sent to Parma and Mondragon for aid, but none could be sent to him, and the prince worked at his fortifications undisturbed. His force was weakened by the withdrawal of Sir Francis Vere, with 3 of the English regiments, Elizabeth having sent peremptory orders that his force should follow those already withdrawn to aid Henry of Navarre in Brittany. Very unwillingly Vere obeyed, and marched to Doesburg on the Yssel. But a fortnight after he arrived there, while he was waiting for ships to transport him to Brittany, the news came to him that Verdugo, having gathered a large force together, was about to attack Prince Maurice in his camp, and Vere at once started to the prince's aid. On the night of the 6th of September, Verdugo, with 4,000 foot and 1,800 horse, wearing their shirts outside their armor to enable them to distinguish each other in the dark, fell upon Maurice's camp. Fortunately, the prince was prepared, having intercepted a letter from Verdugo to the governor of the town. A desperate battle took place, but at break of day, while its issue was still uncertain, Vere, who had marched all night, came up and threw himself into the battle. His arrival was decisive. Verdugo drew off with a loss of 300 killed, and 5 days later Coevorden surrendered, and Prince Maurice's army went into winter quarters. A few weeks later Parma died, killed by the burden Philip threw upon him. Broken down by the constant disappointment of his hopes of carrying his work to a successful end, by the incessant interference of Philip with his plans, and by the anxiety caused by the mutinies arising from his inability to pay his troops, although he had borrowed to the utmost on his own possessions, and pawned even his jewels to keep them from starvation. He was undoubtedly the greatest commander of his age, and had he been left to carry out his own plans, would have crushed out the last ember of resistance in the Netherlands, and consolidated the power of Spain there. He was succeeded in his post by the Archduke Albert, but for a time Ernest Mansfeld continued to command the army, and to manage the affairs in the Netherlands. In March 1593, Prince Maurice appeared with his army in front of Gertrudenburg. The city itself was an important one, and its position on the Maas rendered it of the greatest use to the Spaniards, as through it they were at any moment enabled to penetrate into the heart of Holland. Gertrudenburg and Groningen, the capital of Friesland, were now, indeed, the only important places in the Republic that remained in possession of the Spaniards. Holeno, with a portion of the army, established himself to the east of the city, Maurice with its main body to the west. 2 bridges constructed across the river Doug afforded a means of communication between the 2 armies, and plank roads were laid across the swamps for the passage of baggage wagons. 3,000 soldiers labored incessantly at the works, which were intended not only to insulate the city, but to defend the besiegers from any attack that might be made upon them by a relieving army. The better to protect themselves, miles of country were laid under water, and palisade work erected to render the country impregnable by cavalry. Ernest Mansfeld did his best to relieve the town. His son, Count Charles, with 5,000 troops, had been sent to France, but by sweeping up all the garrisons, he moved with a considerable army towards Gertrudenburg, and challenged Maurice to issue out from his lines to fight him. But the prince had no idea of risking a certain success upon the issue of a battle. 100 pieces of artillery on the batteries played incessantly upon the town, and while a blockading squadron of Zealand ships assisted in the bombardment, and so terrible was the fire that when the town was finally taken, only 4 houses were found to have escaped injury. 2 commandants of the place were killed one after the other, and the garrison of 1,000 veterans, besides the burgher militia, was greatly reduced in strength. At last, after 90 days' siege, the town suddenly fell. Upon the 24th of June, 3 Dutch captains were relieving a guard in the trenches near the great north bastion of the town, when it occurred to them to scale the wall of the fort and see what was going on inside. They threw some planks across the ditch, and taking half a company of soldiers, climbed cautiously up. They gained a foothold before the alarm was given, and there was a fierce hand-to-hand struggle, and 16 of the party fell, and 9 of the garrison. The rest fled into the city. The governor Guyson, rushing to the rescue, without staying to put on his armor, was killed. Count Solms came from the besieging camp to investigate the sudden uproar, and to his profound astonishment was met by a deputation from the city, asking for terms of surrender. Prince Maurice soon afterwards came up, and the terms of capitulation were agreed upon. The garrison were allowed to retire with sidearms and baggage, and 50 wagons were lent to them to carry off the wounded. In the following spring, Coevorden, which had been invested by Verdugo, was relieved, and Groningen, the last great city of the Netherlands in the hand of the Spaniards, was besieged. Mines were driven under its principal bastion, and when these were sprung, after 65 days' siege, the city was forced to surrender. Thus, for the first time, after years of warfare, Holland, Zealand, and Friesland became truly united, and free from the grasp of the hated invader. Throughout the last 3 years of the warfare, Sir Francis Vere had proved an able assistant to the prince, and the English troops had fought bravely side by side with the Dutch. But their contingent had been but a small one, for the majority of Vere's force had, like that of the Spaniards, been withdrawn for service in France. The struggle in that country was nearly at an end. The conversion of Henry of Navarre for the second time to the Catholic religion had raised many Catholics who had hitherto been opposed to him under his banner, while many had fallen away from the ranks of the League in disgust, when Philip of Spain at last threw off the mask of disinterestedness and proposed to make his nephew, the Archduke Ernest, as King of France. In July 1595, a serious misfortune befell the allied army. They had laid siege to Crolles and made considerable progress with the siege, when the Spanish army, under command of Mondragon, the aged governor of Antwerp, marched to its relief. As the army of Maurice was inferior in numbers, the States would not consent to its general action. The siege was consequently raised, and Mondragon, having attained his object, fell back to a position on the Rhine at Orsay, above Rheinberg, whence he could watch the movements of the allied army, encamped on the opposite bank at Bistlich, a few miles below Wesel. The Spanish army occupied both sides of the river, the wing on the right bank being protected from attack by the river Lippe, which falls into the Rhine at Wesel, and by a range of moorland hills called the Testerberg. The Dutch cavalry saw that the slopes of this hill were occupied by the Spaniards, but believed that their force consisted only of a few troops of horse. Young Count Philip of Nassau proposed that a body of cavalry should swim the Lippe and attack and cut them off. Prince Maurice and Sir Francis Vere gave a very reluctant consent to the enterprise, but finally allowed him to take a force of 500 men. With him were his brothers Ernest and Louis, his brother Ernest de Salms, and many other nobles of Holland. Sir Marcellus Box was in command of them. The English contingent was commanded by Sir Nicholas Parker and Robert Vere. On August 22nd, they swam the Lippe and galloped in the direction where they expected to find 2 or 3 troops of the Spanish horse. But Mondragon had received news of their intentions, and they suddenly saw before them half the Spanish army. Without hesitation, the 500 English and Dutch horsemen charged desperately into the enemy's ranks, and fought with extraordinary valor, until altogether overpowered by numbers. Philip of Nassau and his nephew Ernest were both mortally wounded and taken prisoners. Robert Vere was slain by a lance thrust in the face, and many other nobles and gentlemen fell. Thus died one of the 3 brave brothers, for the youngest, Horace, had also joined the army in 1590. The survivors of the band under Sir Nicholas Parker and Marcellus Bax managed to effect a retreat, covered by reserves Prince Maurice had posted on the opposite side of the river. End of Chapter 19. Steenwyk. Recorded by Laura Brenner, close to Grettinger, Iowa. Chapter 20 of By England's Aid by G.A. Henty. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Cadiz. In March 1596, Sir Francis Vere returned to Holland. He had, during his absence in England, been largely taken into the counsels of Queen Elizabeth, and it had been decided the war should be carried into the enemy's country, and a heavy blow struck at the power of Spain. Vere had been appointed to an important command in the proposed expedition, and had now come out charged with the mission of persuading the States General to cooperate heartily with England, and to contribute both money and men. There was much dissension in the States, but they finally agreed to comply with the Queen's wishes, considering that there was no surer way of bringing the war to a termination than to transport it nearer to the heart of the enemy. As soon as the matter was arranged, Sir Francis Vere left The Hague and went to Middelburg, where the preparations for the Dutch portion of the expedition were carried out. It consisted of 22 Dutch ships under Count William of Nassau, and 1,000 of the English troops in the pay of the States. The company commanded by Lionel Vickars was one of those chosen to accompany the expedition, and on the 22nd of April it started from Flushing and joined the British fleet assembled at Dover. This was under the command of Lord Howard as Lord Admiral, the Earl of Essex as General, Lord Thomas Howard as Vice Admiral, and Sir Walter Raleigh as Rear Admiral. Sir Francis Vere was Lieutenant General and Lord Marshal. He was to be the chief adviser of the Earl of Essex, and to have the command of operations on shore. The ships of war consisted of the Ark Royal, the Repulse, Mere Honor, War Spirit, Rainbow, Mary, Rose, Dreadnought, Vanguard, Nonpareil, Lion, Swiftsure, Quittance, and Tremontaine. There were also 12 ships belonging to London, and the 22 Dutch vessels. The fleet, which was largely fitted out at the private expense of Lord Howard and the Earl of Essex, sailed from Dover to Plymouth. Sir Francis Vere went by land and set to work at the organization of the army. A month was thus spent, and on the 1st of June the fleet set sail. It carried 6,360 soldiers and 1,000 volunteers, and was manned by nearly 7,000 sailors. There had been some dispute as to the relative ranks of Sir Francis Vere and Sir Walter Raleigh, and it was settled that Sir Francis should have precedence on shore, and Sir Walter Raleigh at sea. All on board the fleet were full of enthusiasm at the enterprise upon which they were embarked. It was 8 years since the Spanish Armada had sailed to invade England, and now an English fleet was sailing to attack Spain on her own ground. Things had changed indeed in that time. Spain, which had been deemed invincible, had suffered many reverses, while England had made great strides in power, and was now mistress of the seas, on which Spain had formerly considered herself to be supreme. A favorable wind from the northeast carried the fleet rapidly across the Bay of Biscay, and it proceeded on its way, keeping well out of sight of the coast of Portugal. The 3 fastest sailors of the fleet were sent on ahead as soon as they rounded Cape St. Vincent, with orders to capture all small vessels which might carry to Cadiz the tidings of the approach of their fleet. Early on the morning of the 20th of June, the fleet anchored off the spit of San Sebastian on the northern side of the city. Cadiz was defended by the fort of San Sebastian on one side, and that of San Felipe on the other, while the fort of Puntales on the long spit of sand connecting the city with the mainland defended the channel leading up the Porto Real, and covered by its guns, the Spanish galleys and ships of war anchored there. Lying off the town when the English fleet came in sight were 40 richly laden merchant ships about to sail for Mexico, under the convoy of 4 great men of war, 2 Lisbon galleons, 2 argosies, and 3 frigates. As soon as the English were seen, the merchant ships were ordered up the channel to Porto Real, and the men of war and the fleet of 17 war galleys were ranged under the guns of Fort Puntales, to prevent the English passing up. It had first been decided to attempt a landing in the harbor of Galata, on the south side of the city, and although the troops had been got into boats, they were re-embarked, and the fleet sailed round and anchored at the mouth of the channel leading up the bay. A council of war was held that night, and it was decided that the fleet should move up the bay with the tide next morning, and attack the Spanish fleet. The next morning at daybreak, the ships got up their anchors and sailed up the channel, each commander vying with the rest in his eagerness to be first in the fray. They were soon hotly engaged with the enemy, the fort, men of war, and galleys opening a heavy fire upon them, to which, anchoring as close as they could get to the foe, the English ships hotly responded. The galleys were driven closer in under the shelter of the fire of the fort, and the fire was kept up without intermission from 6 o'clock in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. By that time the Spaniards had had enough of it. The galleys slipped their cables and made sail for a narrow channel across the spit, covered by the guns of the fort. 3 of them were captured by Sir John Wingfield and the vanguard, but the rest got through the channel and escaped. The men of war endeavored to run ashore, but boarding parties in boats from the Ark Royal and the Repulse captured 2 of them. The Spaniards set fire to the other 2. The argosies and galleons were also captured. Sir Francis Vere at once took command of the land operations. The boats were all lowered, and the regiments of Essex, Vere, Blount, Gerard, and Clifford told off as a landing party. They were formed in line. The Earl of Essex and Sir Francis Vere took their places in a boat in advance of the line, and were followed by smaller boats crowded with gentlemen volunteers. They landed between the fort of Puntales and the town. The regiments of Blount, Gerard, and Clifford were sent to the narrowest part of the spit to prevent reinforcements being thrown into the place, while those of Essex and Vere and the gentlemen volunteers turned toward Cadiz. Each of these parties consisted of about 1,000 men. The walls of Cadiz were so strong that it had been intended to land guns from the fleet, raise batteries, and make a breach in the walls. Vere, however, perceiving some Spanish cavalry and infantry drawn up outside the walls, suggested to Essex that an attempt should be made to take the place by surprise. The Earl at once agreed to the plan. Vere marched a force across to the west side of the spit, his movements being concealed by the sand hills from the Spanish. Sir John Wingfield, with 200 men, was ordered to march rapidly on against the enemy, driving in their skirmishers, and then to retreat hastily when the main body advanced against him. 300 men under Sir Matthew Morgan were posted as supports to Wingfield, and as soon as the latter's flying force joined them, the whole were to fall upon the Spaniards, and in turn chased them back to the walls, against which the main body under Essex and Vere were to advance. The orders were ably carried out. The Spaniards, in hot chase of the Springfield, found themselves suddenly confronted by Morgan's force, who fell upon them so furiously that they fled back to the town, closely followed by the English. Some of the fugitives made their way in at the gates, while others climbed up at the bastions, which sloped sufficiently to afford foothold. Vere's troops from the Netherlands, led by Essex, also scaled the bastions, and then an inner wall behind it. As soon as they had captured this, they rushed through the streets, shooting and cutting down any who opposed them. Sir Francis Vere, who had also scaled the ramparts, knew that cities captured by assaults had often been lost again by the soldiers scattering. He therefore directed the rest of the troops to burst open the gate. This was with some difficulty effected. He then marched them in good order to the marketplace, where the Spaniards had rallied, and were hotly engaged with Essex. The opposition was soon beaten down, and those defending the town hall were forced to surrender. The troops were then marched through the town, and the garrison driven either into the convent of San Francisco or into the castle of Philippi. The convent surrendered on the same evening, and the castle on the following day. The loss upon the part of the assailants was very small, but Sir John Wingfield was mortally wounded. The English behaved with the greatest courtesy to their captives, their conduct presenting an extraordinary contrast to that of the Spaniards under similar circumstances in the Netherlands. The women were treated with the greatest courtesy, and 5,000 inhabitants, including women and priests, were allowed to leave the town with their clothes. The terms were that the city should pay a ransom of 520,000 ducats, and that some of the chief citizens should remain as hostages for payment. As soon as the fighting ceased, Lionel Vickars accompanied Sir Francis Vere through the streets to set guards, and see that no insult was offered to any of the inhabitants. As they passed along, the door of one of the mansions was thrown open. A gentleman hurried out. He paused for a moment, exclaiming, "Sir Francis Vere!" and then, looking at Lionel, rushed forward towards him with a cry of delight. Sir Francis Vere and Lionel stared in astonishment at the former's name was called, but at the sound of his own, Lionel fell back a step as if stupefied, and then with a cry of "Geoffrey!" fell into his brother's arms. "It is indeed Geoffrey Vickars!" Sir Francis Vere exclaimed. "Why, Geoffrey, what miracle is this? We have thought you dead these 6 years, and now we find you transmuted into a Spanish Don." "I may look like one, Sir Francis," Geoffrey said as he shook his old commander's hand, "but I am English to the backbone still. But my story is too long to tell now. You will be doubtless too busy tonight to spare time to listen to it, but I pray you to breakfast with me in the morning. Then I will briefly relate to you the outline of my adventures. Can you spare my brother for tonight, Sir Francis?" "I would do so were there 10 times the work to be got through," Sir Francis replied. "Assuredly, I would not keep asunder for a minute 2 brothers who have so long been separated. I will breakfast with you in the morning, and hear this strange story of yours, for strange it most assuredly is, since it has changed my young page of the Netherlands into a Spanish hidalgo." "I am no hidalgo, Sir Francis, but a trader of Cadiz, and I own that although I have been in some way a prisoner, seeing that I could not effect my escape, I have not fared badly. Now, Lionel, come in. I have another surprise for you." Lionel, still confused and wonder-stricken at this apparent resurrection of his brother from the dead, followed him upstairs. Geoffrey led the way into a handsomely furnished apartment, where a young lady was sitting with a boy 2 years old in her lap. "Dolores, this is my brother Lionel, of whom you have so often heard me speak. Lionel, this is my wife, and my eldest boy, who is named after you." It was some time before Lionel could completely realize the position, and it was not until Dolores, in the somewhat broken English, bade him welcome that he found his tongue. "But I cannot understand it," he exclaimed, after responding to the words of Dolores. "I saw my brother in the middle of the battle with the Armada. We came into collision with a great galleon. We lost one of our masts, and I never saw Geoffrey afterwards, and we all thought he had either been shot by the musketeers on the galleon, or had been knocked overboard and killed by the falling mast. I had hoped that long before this you would have heard of my safety, Lionel, for a sailor friend of mine promised if he reached England to go down at once to Hedingham to tell them there. He left the ship he was in out in the West Indies, and I hoped they had reached home safely. We have heard nothing, Geoffrey. The man has never come with your message, but now tell me how you were saved." "I was knocked over by the mast, Lionel, but as you see I was not killed. I climbed up into a passing Spanish ship, and concealed myself in the chains until she was sunk. Then I was, with many of the crew, picked up by the boats of the other ships. I pretended to have lost my senses and my speech, and none suspected that I was English. The ship I was on board of was one of those which succeeded after terrible hardships in returning to Spain. An Irish gentleman on board her, to whom I confided my secret, took me as a servant. After many adventures, I sailed with him for Italy, where we hoped to get a ship for England. On the way, we were attacked by Barbary pirates. We beat them off, but I was taken prisoner. I remained a captive among them for nearly 2 years, and then, with a fellow prisoner, escaped, together with Dolores and her father, who had also been captured by the pirates. We reached Spain in safety, and I have since passed as one of the many exiles from England and Ireland who have taken refuge here, and Señor Mendez, my wife's father, was good enough to bestow her hand upon me, partly in gratitude for the services I had rendered him in his escape, partly because he saw she would break her heart if he refused. "You know that is not true, Geoffrey," Dolores interrupted. "Never mind, Dolores, it is near enough. And with his daughter," he continued, "he gave me a share in his business. I have been a fortunate man indeed, Lionel, but I have always longed for a chance to return home. Until now, none has ever offered itself, and I have grieved continually at the thought that my father and mother and you were mourning for me as dead. Now you have the outline of the story. Tell me about all at home." "Our father and mother are both well, Geoffrey, though your supposed loss was a great blow for them. But is it still home for you, Geoffrey? Do you really mean to return with us?" "Of course I do, Lionel. At the time I married, I arranged with Señor Mendez that whenever an opportunity occurred, I was to return home, taking, of course, Dolores with me. She has been learning English ever since, and although naturally she would rather that we remained here, she is quite prepared to make her home in England. We have 2 boys, this youngster and a baby 3 months old, so you see you have all at once acquired nephews as well as brother and sister. Here is Señor Mendez. This is my brother, Señor, the Lionel after whom I named my boy, though I never dreamed that our next meeting would take place within the walls of Cadiz." "You have astonished us, Señor," the merchant said courteously. "We thought that Cadiz was safe from an attack, and though we were aware that you had defeated our fleet, we were astonished indeed when 2 hours since we heard by the din and firing in the streets that you had captured the city. Truly, you English do not suffer the grass to grow under your feet. When we woke this morning, no one dreamed of danger, and now, in the course of 1 day, you have destroyed our fleet, captured our town, and have our lives and properties at your disposal." "Your lives are in no danger, Señor, and all those who choose are free to depart without harm or hindrance. But as to your property, I don't mean yours, of course, because as Geoffrey's the father-in-law, I am sure that Sir Francis Vere will inflict no fine upon you. But the city generally will have to pay, I hear, some 500,000 ducats as ransom." "That is nothing," the Spaniard said, "to the loss the city will suffer in the loss of the 40 merchant ships, which you will doubtless capture or burn. Right glad am I that no cargo of mine is on board any of them, for I do not trade with Mexico, but I am sure that the value of the ships with their cargoes cannot be less than 20 millions of ducats. This will fall upon the traders of this town and of Seville. Still, I own that the ransom of 500,000 for a city like Cadiz seems to me to be very moderate, and the tranquillity that already prevails in the town is beyond all praise. But this such had been the behavior of my countrymen in the Netherlands." Don Mendez spoke in a tone of deep depression, and Geoffrey made a sign to his brother to come out onto the balcony, while the merchant took a seat beside his daughter. "'Tis best to leave them alone," he said as he looked down into the street, where the English and their Dutch allies, many of whom had now landed, were wandering about, examining the public buildings and churches, while the inhabitants looked with timid curiosity from their windows and balconies at the men who had, as if by magic, suddenly become their masters. "I can see that the old gentleman is terribly cut up. Of course, nothing has been said between us yet, for it was not until we heard the sound of firing in the streets that anyone thought there was the smallest risk of your capturing the city. Nevertheless, he must be sure that I shall take this opportunity of returning home. It has always been understood between us that I should do so as soon as any safe method of making a passage should be discovered. But after being here with him more than 3 years, he had doubtless come to believe that such a chance should never come during his lifetime, and the thought of an early separation from his daughter and the break-up of our household here must be painful to him in the extreme. It has been settled that I should remain partner in the firm, and should manage our affairs in England and Holland, but this will, of course, be a comparatively small business until peace is restored. The ships are free to come and go on both sides as they please. But I think it is likely he will himself come to live with us in England, and that we shall make that the headquarters of the firm, employing our ships in traffic with Holland, France, and the Mediterranean, until peace is restored with Spain, and having only an agent here to conduct such business as we may be able to carry on under the present stringent regulations. In point of fact, even if we wound up our affairs and disposed of our ships, it would matter little to us, for Mendez is a very rich man, and as Dolores is his only child, he has no great motive beyond the occupation it gives him for continuing in business. So, you are a captain now, Lionel. Have you had a great deal of fighting? Not a great deal. The Spaniards have been too much occupied with their affairs in France to give us much work to do. In Holland I took my part in the adventure that led to the capture of Breda, did some fighting in France with the army of Henry of Navarre, and have been concerned in a good many sieges and skirmishes. I do not know whether you heard of the death of Robert Vere. He came out just after the business of the Armada, and fell in the fight the other day near Wesel, a mad business of Count Philip of Nassau. Horace is serving with his troop. We have recovered all the cities in the 3 provinces, and Holland is now virtually rid of the Spaniards. Things have greatly changed since the days of Sluys and Bergen-op-Zoom. Holland has increased marvelously in strength and wealth. We have now a splendidly organized army, and should not fear meeting the Spaniards in the open field, if they would but give the chance to do so in anything like equal numbers. Sir Francis is marshal of our army here, and is now considered the ablest of our generals, and he and Prince Maurice have never yet met with a serious disaster. But how have you escaped the Inquisition here, Geoffrey? I thought they laid hands on every heretic. So they do, Geoffrey replied, but you see, they have never dreamed that I was a heretic. The English, Irish, and Scotchmen here, either serving in the army or living quietly as exiles, are, of course, all Catholics, and as they suppose me to be one of them, it does not seem to have entered their minds that I was a Protestant. Since I have been here, I have gone with my wife and father-in-law to church, and have said my prayers in my own way, while they have said theirs. I cannot say that I have liked it, but as there was no church of my own, it did not go against my conscience to kneel in theirs. I can tell you that, after being for nearly a couple of years a slave among the Moors, one thinks less of these distinctions than one used to do. Had the Inquisition laid hands on me, and questioned me, I should at once have declared myself a Protestant. But as long as I was not questioned, I thought it no harm to go quietly and pay my devotions in church, even though there were many things in that church with which I wholly disagree. Dolores and I have talked the matter over often, and have arrived at the conclusion long since that there is no great difference between us, as would lead us to hate each other. Lionel laughed. I suppose we generally see matters as we want to, Geoffrey, but it will be rather a shock to our good father and mother when you bring home a Catholic daughter. I dare say when she has once settled in England among us, Lionel, she will turn round to our views on the subject. Not that I should ever try to convert her, but it will likely enough come of itself. Of course, she has been brought up with the belief that heretics are very terrible people. She has naturally grown out of the belief now, and is ready to admit that there may be good heretics as well as good Catholics. Such is a long step for a Spanish woman to take, and I have no fear that the rest will come in time. At present, I have most carefully abstained from talking with her on the subject. When she is once in England, I shall be able to talk to her freely without endangering her life by doing so. Upon the following morning, Sir Francis Vere breakfasted with Geoffrey, and then he and Lionel heard the full account of his adventures, and the manner in which it came about that he was found established as a merchant in Cadiz. They then talked over the situation. Sir Francis was much vexed that the Lord Admiral had not complied with the earnest request that the Earl of Essex had sent him, as soon as he landed, to take prompt measures for the pursuit of the capture of the merchant ships. Instead of doing this, the Admiral, considering the force that had landed to be dangerously weak, had sent large reinforcements on shore as soon as the boats came off, and the consequence was that at dawn that morning masses of smoke, rising from the Porto Real, showed that the Duke of Medina Sidonia had set the merchant ships on fire, rather than that they should fall into the hands of the English. For a fortnight the captors of Cadiz remained in possession. Señor Mendez had, upon the day after their entry, discussed the future with Geoffrey. To the latter's great satisfaction, he took it for granted that his son-in-law should sail with Dolores and the children in the English fleet, and he at once entered into arrangements with him for his undertaking the management of the business of the firm in England and Holland. Had I wound up my affairs, I should accompany you at once, for Dolores is everything to me, and you, Geoffrey, have also a large share of my affection. But this is impossible. We have at present all our 15 ships at sea, and these, on their return to port, would be confiscated at once were I to leave. Besides, there are large transactions open with the merchants of Seville and elsewhere. Therefore, I must, for the present at any rate, remain here. I shall incur no odium by your departure. It will be supposed that you have reconciled yourself with your government, and your going home will therefore seem only natural, and it will be seen that I could not, however much I were inclined, interfere to prevent the departure of Dolores and the children with you. I propose to send on board your ships the greater portion of my goods here suitable for your market. This again will not excite bad feelings, as I shall say that you, as my partner, insisted upon your right to take your share of our merchandise back to England with you, leaving me as my portion our fleet of vessels. Therefore, all will go on here as before. I shall gradually reduce my business and dispose of the ships, transmitting my fortune to a banker in Brussels, who will be able to send it to England through merchants in Antwerp, and you can purchase vessels to replace those I sell. I calculate that it will take me a year to complete all my arrangements. After that, I shall again sail for Italy, and shall come to England either by sea or by travelling through Germany, as circumstances may dictate. On arriving in London, I shall know where to find you, for by that time you will be well known there, and at any rate, the bankers to whom my money is sent will be able to inform you of your address. These arrangements were carried out, and at the departure of the fleet, Geoffrey, with Dolores and the children, sailed in Sir Francis Vere's ship, the Rainbow, Sir Francis having insisted on giving up his own cabin for the use of Dolores. On leaving Cadiz, the town was fired, and the cathedral, the church of the Jesuits, the nunneries of Santa Maria and Candelaria, 290 houses, and the greatest loss of all, the library of the Jesuits, containing valuable manuscripts respecting the Incas of Peru, were destroyed. The destruction of the Spanish fleet, the enormous loss caused by the burning of Cadiz, and the loss of the rich merchant fleet struck a terrible blow at the power and resources of Spain. Her trade never recovered from its effects, and her prestige suffered very greatly in the eyes of Europe. Philip never rallied from the blow to his pride inflicted by its humiliation. Lionel had at first been almost shocked to find that Geoffrey had married a Spanish woman, and a Catholic, but the charming manner of Dolores, her evident desire to please, and the deep affection with which he regarded her husband, soon won his heart. He, Sir Francis Vere, and the other officers and volunteers on board, vied with each other in attention to her during the voyage, and Dolores, who had hitherto been convinced that Geoffrey was a strange exception to the rule that all Englishmen were rough and savage animals, and who looked forward with much secret dread to taking up her residence among them, was quite delighted, and assured Geoffrey she was at last convinced that all she had heard to the disadvantage of his countrymen was wholly untrue. The fleet touched at Plymouth, where the news of the immense success they had gained was received with great rejoicings, and after taking in fresh water and stores, they proceeded along the coast and anchored in the mouth of the Thames. Here the greater part of the fleet was disbanded. The Rainbow and a few other vessels sailed up to Greenwich, where the captains and officers were received with great honor by the Queen, and were feasted and made much of by the city. The brothers, the day after the ship cast anchor, proceeded to town, and there hired horses for their journey down into Essex. This was accomplished in 2 days, Geoffrey riding with Dolores on a pillion behind him, with her baby in her lap, while young Lionel was on the saddle before his uncle. When they approached Hedingham, Lionel said, "I had best ride forward, Geoffrey, to break the news to them of your coming. Although our mother has always declared that she would not give up hope that you should some day be restored to us, they have now really mourned you as dead." "Very well, Lionel. It is but a mile or so. I will dismount and put the boy up in the saddle, and walk beside him, and we shall be in a quarter of an hour after you." The delight of Mr. and Mrs. Vickars on hearing Geoffrey was alive and close at hand was so great that the fact he brought home a Spanish wife, which would, under other circumstances, have been a great shock to them, was now scarcely felt, and when the rapturous greetings with which he was received on his arrival were over, they welcomed his pretty young wife with a degree of warmth which fully satisfied him. Her welcome was, of course, in the first place as Geoffrey's wife, but in a very short time his father and mother both came to love her for herself, and Dolores very quickly found herself far happier at Hedingham Rectory than she had thought she could be away from her native Spain. The announcement of Geoffrey, made shortly after his arrival, that he had altogether abandoned the trade of soldiering, and should in future make his home in London, trading in conjunction with his father-in-law, assisted to reconcile them to his marriage. After a fortnight's stay at Hedingham, Geoffrey went up to London, and here took a house in the city, purchased several vessels, and entered upon business, being enabled at once to take a good position among the merchants of London, thanks to the ample funds with which he was provided. 2 months later he went down to Essex, and brought up the Lores and the children, and established them in his new abode. The apprenticeship which he had served in trade at Cadiz enabled Geoffrey to start with confidence in his business. He at once notified all the correspondents of the firm in the different ports of Europe that in future the business carried on by Señor Juan Mendez at Cadiz would have its headquarters in London, and that the firm should trade with all its ports, with the exception of those of Spain. The result was that before many months had elapsed, there were few houses in London doing a larger trade with the continent than that of Mendez and Vickars, under which title they had traded from the time of Geoffrey's marriage with the Lores. End of Chapter 20. Cadiz. Recorded by Laura Brenner, close to Grettinger, Iowa, on May 7th, 2026. Chapter 21 of By England's Aid by G.A. Henty. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. The Battle of Nieuport. The year after the capture of Cadiz, Lionel Vickars sailed under Sir Francis Vere with the expedition designed to attack the fleet which Philip of Spain had gathered at Ferrol, with the intention, it was believed, of invading Ireland in retaliation for the disaster at Cadiz. The expedition met with terrible weather in the Bay of Biscay, and put back, scattered and disabled, to Plymouth and Falmouth. In August they again sailed, but they were so battered by another storm that the expedition against Ferrol was abandoned, and they sailed to the Azores. There, after a skirmish with the Spaniards, they scattered among the islands, but missed a great Spanish fleet laden with silver from the west, and finally returned to England without having accomplished anything, while they suffered from another tempest on their way home, and reached Plymouth with difficulty. Fortunately, the same storm scattered and destroyed the great Spanish fleet at Ferrol, and the weather thus, for the second time, saved England from invasion. Late in the autumn, after his return from the expedition, Sir Francis Vere went over to Holland, and by his advice, Prince Maurice prepared in December to attack a force of 4,000 Spanish infantry and 600 cavalry, which, under the command of the Count of Varus, had gathered at the village of Turnhout, 20 miles from Breda. A force of 5,000 foot and 800 horse were secretly assembled at Gertrudenberg. Sir Francis Vere brought an English regiment, and personally commanded one of the two troops into which the English cavalry were divided. Sir Robert Sidney came with 300 of the English garrison of Flushing, and Sir Alexander Murray with a Scotch regiment. The expedition started on the 23rd of January, 1598, and after marching 24 miles, reached the village of Rivals, 3 miles from Turnhout, 2 hours after dark. The night was bitter cold, and after cooking supper, the men wrapped themselves up in their cloaks, and lay down on the frozen ground until daybreak. The delay, although necessary, enabled the enemy to make their escape. The news that the allies had arrived close at hand reached Count Varus at midnight, and a retreat was at once ordered. Baggage wagons were packed and dispatched, escorted by the cavalry, and before dawn the whole force was well on its road. Prince Maurice had set off an hour before daybreak, and on reaching Turnhout found that the rearguard of the enemy had just left the village. They had broken down the wooden bridge across the river Ea, only one plank being left standing, and had stationed a party to defend it. Maurice held a hasty council of war. All, with the exception of Sir Francis Vere and Sir Marcellus Bax, were against pursuit, but Maurice took the advice of the minority. Vere, with 200 Dutch musketeers, advanced against the bridge. His musketry fire drove off the guard, and with a few mounted officers and the 200 musketeers, he set out in pursuit. He saw that the enemy's infantry were marching but slowly, and guessed that they were delayed by the baggage wagons in front. The country was wooded, and he threw the musketeers among the trees, with orders to keep up a dropping fire, while he himself, with 16 horsemen, followed closely upon the enemy along the road. Their rearguard kept up a skirmishing fire, slightly wounding Vere in the leg, but all this caused delay, and it was 3 hours before they emerged on an open heath, 3 miles from the village. Vere placed his musketeers among some woods and enclosed fields on the left of the heath, and ordered them to keep up a brisk fire, and to show themselves as if advancing to the attack. He himself, reinforced by some more horsemen who had come up, continued to follow in the open. The heath was 3 miles across, and Vere, constantly skirmishing with the Spanish infantry, who were formed in 4 solid squares, kept watching for the appearance of Maurice and the cavalry. At length these came in sight. Vere galloped up to the prince and urged that a charge should be made at once. The prince assented. Vere, with the English cavalry, charged down upon the rear of the squares, while Hollenel swept down with the Dutch cavalry upon their flanks. The Spanish musketeers fired and at once fled, and the cavalry dashed in among the squares of pikemen and broke them. Several of the companies of horse galloped on in pursuit of the enemy's horse and baggage. Vere saw that these would be repulsed, and formed up the English cavalry to cover their retreat. In a short time the disordered horse came back at full gallop, pursued by the Spanish cavalry, but these, seeing Vere's troops ready to receive them, retreated at once. Count Verus was slain, together with 300 of the Spanish infantry. 600 prisoners were taken, and 38 colors fell into the victors' hands. The success was gained entirely by the 800 allied horse. The infantry never arrived upon the field. The brilliant little victory, which was one of the first gained by the Allies in the open field, was the cause of great rejoicings. Not only were the Spaniards no longer invincible, but they had been routed by a force but 1/6 of their own number, and the battle showed how greatly the individual prowess of the two peoples had changed during the progress of the war. The Archduke Ernest had died in 1595, and had been succeeded by the Archduke Albert in the government of the Netherlands. He had with him no generals comparable with Parma, or even with Alva. His troops had lost their faith in themselves and their contempt for their foes. Holland had grown rich and prosperous, while the enormous expenses of carrying on the war, both in the Netherlands and in France, together with the loss of the Armada, the destruction of the great fleet at Ferrol, and the capture of Cadiz and the ships there, had exhausted the resources of Spain, and Philip was driven to make advances for peace to France and England. Henry IV, knowing that peace with Spain meant an end to the civil war that had so long exhausted France, at once accepted the terms of Philip, and made a separate peace, in spite of the remonstrances of the ambassadors of England and Holland, to both of which countries he owed it in no small degree that he had been enabled to support himself against the faction of the Guises, backed by the power of Spain. A fresh treaty was made between England and the Netherlands, Sir Francis Vere being sent out as a special ambassador to negotiate. England was anxious for peace, but would not desert the Netherlands if they, on their part, would relieve her to some extent of the heavy expenses caused by the war. This the states consented to do, and the treaty was duly signed on both sides. A few days before its conclusion, Lord Burleigh, who had been Queen Elizabeth's chief adviser for 40 years, died, and within a month of its signature, Philip of Spain, whose schemes he had so long opposed, followed him to the grave. On the 6th of the previous May, Philip had formally ceded the Netherlands to his daughter Isabella, between whom and the Archduke Albert a marriage had been arranged. This took place on the 18th of April, following shortly after his death. It was celebrated at Valencia, and at the same time King Philip III was united to Margaret of Austria. In the course of 1599, there was severe fighting on the swampy island between the rivers Vaal and Maas, known as the Balmawat, and a fresh attempt at invasion by the Spaniards was repulsed with heavy loss, Sir Francis Vere and the English troops taking a leading part in the operations. The success thus gained decided the States General to undertake an offensive campaign in the following year. The plan they decided upon was opposed both by Prince Maurice and Sir Francis Vere as being altogether too hazardous, but the States, who upon most occasions were averse to anything like bold action, upon the present occasion stood firm to their decision. The plan was to land an army near Ostend, which was held by the English, and to besiege the town of Nieuport, west of Ostend, and after that to attack Dunkirk. In the opinion of the two generals, an offensive operation direct from Holland would have been far preferable, as in case of disaster the army could fall back upon one of their fortified towns, whereas if beaten upon the coast, they might be cut off from Ostend and entirely destroyed. However, their opinions were overruled, and the expedition prepared. It consisted of 12,000 infantry, 1,600 cavalry, and 10 guns. It was formed into 3 divisions. The van, 4,500 strong, including 1,600 English veterans, was commanded by Sir Francis Vere. The second division by Count Everard Solms. The rear division by Count Ernest of Nassau, while Count Louis Gunther of Nassau was in command of the cavalry. The army embarked at Flushing and landed at Philippine, a town at the head of the Brakeman Inlet. There was at the time only a small body of Spaniards in the neighborhood, but as soon as the news reached the Archduke Albert at Brussels, he concentrated his army round Ghent. The troops had for some time been in a mutinous state, but as was always the case with them, they returned to their habits of military obedience the moment danger threatened. The Dutch army advanced by rapid marches to the neighborhood of Ostend, and captured the fort and redoubts which the Spaniards had raised to prevent its garrison undertaking offensive operations. 2,000 men were left to garrison these important positions, which lay on the line of march which the Spaniards must take, coming from Bruges to Nieuport. The rest of the army then made their way across the country, intersected by ditches, and upon the following day arrived before Nieuport and prepared to besiege it. The Dutch fleet had arrived off the town and cooperated with the army in building a bridge across the little river, preparing for the siege. Towards the evening, however, the news arrived from Ostend, 9 miles away, that a large force of the enemy had appeared before one of the forts just captured. Most of the officers were of opinion that the Spanish force was not a large one, and that it was a mere feint to induce the Dutch to abandon the siege of Nieuport and return to Ostend. Sir Francis Vere maintained that it was the main body of the Archduke's army, and advised Maurice to march back at once with his whole force to attack the enemy before they had time to take the forts. Later in the evening, however, 2 of the messengers arrived with the news that the forts had surrendered. Prince Maurice then, in opposition to Vere's advice, sent off 2,500 infantry, 500 horse, and 2 guns, and under the command of Ernest of Nassau, to prevent the enemy from crossing the low ground between Ostend and the sandhills. Vere insisted that the whole army ought to move. It fell out exactly as he predicted. The detachment met the whole Spanish army, and broke and fled at the first fire, and thus 2,500 men were lost in addition to the 2,000 who had been left to garrison the forts. At break of day the army marched down to the creek, and as soon as the water had ebbed sufficiently, waded across and took up their position among the sandhills on the seashore. The enemy's army was already in sight, marching along on the narrow strip of land between the foot of the dunes and the sea. A few hundred yards towards Ostend, the sandhills narrowed, and here Sir Francis Vere took up his position with his division. He placed 1,000 picked men, consisting of 250 English, 250 of Prince Maurice's guard, and 500 musketeers, partly upon 2 sandhills called the East and West Hill, and partly in the bottom between them, where they were covered by a low ridge connecting the 2 hills. The 500 musketeers were placed so that their fire swept the ground on the south, by which alone the enemy's cavalry could pass on that side. On the other ridge, facing the sea, were 700 English pikemen and musketeers. 250 English and 50 of the guard held the position of the East Hill, which was most exposed to the attack. The rest of the division, which consisted of 650 English and 2,000 Dutch, were placed in readiness to reinforce the advanced party. Half the cavalry, under Count Louis, were on the right of the dunes, and the other half, under Marcellus Bax, was on the left by the sea. The divisions of Count Solmes and Count Ernest of Nassau were also on the seashore in the rear of West Hill. A council of war was held to decide whether the army should advance to the attack or await it. Vere advised the latter course, and his advice was adopted. The Archduke's army consisted of 10,000 infantry, 1,600 horse, and 6 guns. Marshal Zepena was in command, while the cavalry were led by the Admiral of Aragon. They rested for 2 hours before advancing, waiting until the rise of the tide should render the sands unserviceable for cavalry, their main reliance being upon their infantry. The cavalry led the advance, but the 2 guns Vere had placed on the West Hill plied them so hotly with shot that they fell back in confusion. It was now high tide, and there was but 30 yards between the sea and the sandhills. The Spaniards therefore marched the infantry into the dunes, while the cavalry prepared to advance between the sandhills and the cultivated fields inland. The 2nd and 3rd divisions of Maurice's army also moved away from the shore inland. They now numbered but 3,000 men, as the 4,500 who had been lost belonged entirely to these divisions, Sir Francis Vere's division having been left intact. It was upon the 1st Division that the whole brunt of the battle fell. They received some assistance from the 1,000 men remaining under Count Solmes that were posted next to them, while the rear division was never engaged at all. At 2:30 in the afternoon of the 2nd of June, 1600, the battle began. Vere's plan was to hold his advanced position as long as possible, bringing the reserves up as required, until he had worn out the Spaniards, then descend for the other 2 divisions and fall upon them. The company of Lionel Vickars formed part of the 300 men stationed on the East Hill, where Vere himself had also taken up his position. After an exchange of fire, for some time, 500 picked Spanish infantry rushed across the hollow between the 2 armies, and charged the hill. For half an hour a desperate struggle took place. The Spaniards were obliged to fall back behind some low ridges at its foot. In the meantime the enemy's cavalry had advanced along the grass-grown tract, 150 yards wide, between the foot of the dunes and the cultivated country inland. They were received, however, by so hot a fire by the 500 musketeers, posted by Vere in the sandhills on their flank, and by the 2 cannon on the West Hill, that they fell back upon their infantry just as the Dutch horse, under Count Louis, advanced to charge them. Vere sent orders to 100 Englishmen to move round from the ridge and to attack the Spaniards, who had fallen back from the attack of East Hill, on their flank, while 60 men charged down the hill and engaged them in front. The Spaniards broke and fled back to their main body. Then, being largely reinforced, they advanced and seized a sandy knoll near West Hill. Here they were attacked by the English, and after a long and obstinate fight, forced to retire. The whole of the Spanish force now advanced, and tried to drive the English back from their position on the low ridge, across the bottom connecting the two hills. The 700 men were drawn from the north ridge, and as the fight grew hotter, the whole of the 1,600 English were brought up. Vere sent for reinforcements, but none came up, and for hours the 1,600 Englishmen alone checked the advance of the whole of the Spanish army. Sir Francis Vere was fighting like a private soldier in the midst of his troops. He received 2 balls in the leg, but still kept his seat and encouraged his men. At last the little band, receiving no aid or reinforcements from the Dutch, were forced to fall back. As they did so, Vere's horse fell dead under him, and partly upon him, and it was with the greatest difficulty that those around him extricated him. On reaching the battery on the sands, Vere found 1,000 Dutch of his division, who asserted they had received no orders to advance. There were also 300 foot under Sir Horace Vere, and some cavalry under Captain Ball. These and Horace's infantry at once charged the Spaniards, who were pouring out from the sandhills near to the beach, and drove them back. The Spaniards had now captured East Hill, and 2,000 of their infantry advanced into the valley beyond, and drove back the musketeers from the south ridge, and a large force advanced along the Greenway. But their movements were slow, for they were worn out by their long struggle, and the English officers had time to rally their men again. Horace Vere returned from his charge on the beach, and the other companies rallied and joined him, and charged furiously down upon the 2,000 Spaniards. The whole of the Dutch and English cavalry also advanced. Solmes's 1,000 men came up and took part in the action, and the batteries plied the Spaniards with their shot. The latter had done all they could, and were confounded by this fresh attack when they had considered the victory as won. In spite of the efforts of their officers, they broke and fled in all directions, the Archduke heading their flight, and never drew rein until he reached Brussels. Zepena and the Admiral of Aragon were both taken prisoners, and about a third of the Spanish army killed and wounded. Of the 1,600 English, half were killed or wounded, while the rest of the Dutch army suffered scarcely any loss, a fact that shows clearly to whom the honor of the victory belongs. Prince Maurice, in his letter to the Queen, attributed his success entirely to the good order and directions of Sir Francis Vere. Thus, in a pitched battle, the English troops met and defeated an army of 6 times their strength of the veterans of Spain, and showed conclusively that the English fighting men had in no way deteriorated since the days of Agincourt, the last great battle they had fought upon the continent. The Battle of Nieuport may be considered to have set the final seal upon the independence of Holland. The lesson first taught at Turnhout had now been impressed with crushing force. The Spaniards were no longer invincible. They had been twice signally defeated in an open field by greatly inferior forces. Their prestige was annihilated, and although a war continued, there was no longer the slightest chance that the result of the long and bloody struggle would be reversed, or that Spain would ever again recover her grip of the lost provinces. Sir Francis Vere was laid up for some months with his wounds. Among the officers who fought under him at Nieuport were several whose names were to become famous for the part they afterwards bore in the civil struggle in England. Among others were Fairfax, Ogley, Lambert, and Parker. Among those who received the honor of knighthood for their behavior at the battle was Lionel Vickars. He had been severely wounded at the fight at East Hill, and was sent home to be cured there. It was some months before he again took the field, which he did upon the receipt of a letter from Sir Francis Vere, telling him that the Spaniards were closing in great force round Ostend, and that his company was one of those who had been sent off to aid in the defence of that town. During his stay in England, he had spent some time with Geoffrey in London. Juan Mendez had now arrived there, and the business carried on by him and Geoffrey was flourishing greatly. Dolores had much missed the outdoor life to which she was accustomed, and her father had bought a large house with a fine garden in Chelsea, and she and Geoffrey were now installed there with him, Geoffrey going to and fro from the city by boat. They had now replaced the Spanish trading vessels by an equal number of English craft, and at the suggestion of Juan Mendez himself, his name now stood second to that of Geoffrey, for the prejudice against foreigners was still strong in England. End of Chapter 21, The Battle of Nieuport, recorded by Laura Brenner, close to Grettinger, Iowa, on May 8th, 2026. Chapter 22 of By England's Aid by G.A. Henty. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, Old Friends. The succession of blows that had been given to the power and commerce of Spain had immensely benefited the trade of England and Holland. France, devastated by civil war, had been in no position to take advantage of the falling off of the Spanish commerce. and had indeed herself suffered enormously by the emigration of tens of thousands of the most intelligent of her population, owing to her persecution of the Protestants. Her traders and manufacturers largely belonged to the new religion, and these had carried their industry and knowledge to England and Holland. Thus the religious bigotry of the kings of Spain and France had resulted in enormous loss to the trade and commerce of those countries, and in corresponding advantage to their Protestant rivals. Geoffrey Vickars and his partner reaped the full benefit of the change. The extensive acquaintance of the Spanish trader with merchants in all the Mediterranean ports enabled him to turn a large share of the new current of trade into the hands of Geoffrey and himself. The capital, which he transferred from Spain to England, was very much larger than that employed by the majority of English merchants, whose wealth had been small indeed in comparison to that of the merchant princes of the great centres of trade, such as Antwerp, Amsterdam, Genoa, and Cadiz, and Geoffrey Vickars soon came to be looked upon as one of the leading merchants in the city of London. "There can be no doubt, Geoffrey," his brother said as he lay on a couch in the garden in the early days of his convalescence, and looked at the river dotted with boats that flowed past it. "The falling of that mast was a fortunate thing for you. One can never tell how things will turn out. It might have seemed as if, were you not drowned at once, your lot would have been either a life's work in the Spanish galleys, or death in the dungeons of the Inquisition. Instead of this, here you are, a wealthy merchant in the city, with a charming wife, and a father-in-law who is, although a Spaniard, one of the kindest and best men I have ever met. All this time, I, who was not knocked over by the mast, have been drilling recruits, making long marches, and occasionally fighting battles, and am no richer now than the day when we started together as Francis Vere's pages. It is true I received the honour of knighthood, and that, of course, I prize much, but I have only my captain's page to support my dignity, and as I hardly think Spain will continue this useless struggle much longer, in which case our army in Holland will be speedily disbanded, the prospect before me is not altogether an advantageous one." "You must marry an heiress, Lionel," Geoffrey laughed. "Surely Sir Lionel Vickars, one of the heroes of Nieuport, and many another field, should be able to win the heart of some fair English damsel, with broad acres as her dower. But seriously, Lionel," he went on, changing his tone, "if peace comes, and with it lack of employment, the best thing for you will be to join me. Mendez is getting on in years, and although he is working hard at present, in order, as he says, to set everything going smoothly and well here, he is looking forward to taking matters more easily, and to spending his time in tranquil pleasure with Dolores and her children. Therefore, whensoever it pleases you, there is a place for you here. We always contemplated our lines running in the same groove, and I should be very glad that they should do so still. When the time comes, we can discuss what share you shall have of the business, but at any rate, I can promise you that it will be sufficient to make you a rich man." "Thank you with all my heart, Geoffrey. It may be that some day I will accept your offer, though I fear you will find me but a sorry assistant. It seems to me that after 12 years of campaigning, I am little fitted for life as a city merchant." "I went through plenty of adventure for 6 years, Lionel, but my father-in-law has from the first been well satisfied with my capacity for business. You are not 27 yet. You have had enough rough campaigning to satisfy anyone, and should be glad now of an easier and more sober method of life. Well, there is no occasion to settle anything at present, and I can well understand that you should prefer remaining in the army until the war comes to an end. When it does so, we can talk the matter over again. Only be well assured that the offer will always be open to you, and I shall be glad indeed to have you with me." A few days after Lionel left him, Geoffrey was passing along Cheap, when he stopped suddenly, and stared hard at a gentleman who was approaching him, and then rushed forward with outstretched hands. "My dear Gerald," he exclaimed, "I am glad to see you." The gentleman started back with an expression of the profoundest astonishment. "Is it possible?" he cried. "Is it really Geoffrey Vickars?" "Myself, and no other, Gerald." "The saints be praised! Why, I have been thinking of you all these years as either dead or labouring at an oar in the Moorish galleys. By what good fortune did you escape, and how is it I find you here, looking for all the world like a merchant of the city?" "It is too long a story to tell now, Gerald. Where are you staying?" "I have lodgings at Westminster, being at present a suitor at court." "Is your wife with you?" "She is. I have left my 4 children at home in Ireland." "Then bring her to sup with me this evening. I have a wife to introduce to yours, and as she is also a Spaniard, it will doubtless be a pleasure to them both." "You astound me, Geoffrey. However, you shall tell me all about it this evening, for be assured that we shall come. Inez has so often talked about you, and lamented the ill fortune that befell you owing to your ardour." "At 6 o'clock, then," Geoffrey said. "I generally dwell with my father-in-law at Chelsea, but am just at present at home. My house is in St. Mary Axe. Anyone there will tell you which it is." That evening the two friends had a long talk together. Geoffrey learned that Gerald Burke reached Italy without further adventure, and thence took ship to Bristol, and so crossed over to Ireland. On his petition and solemn promise of good behaviour in future, he was pardoned, and a small portion of his estate restored to him. He was now in London, endeavouring to obtain a remission of the forfeiture of the rest. "I may be able to help you with that," Geoffrey said. "Sir Francis Vere is high in favour at court, and he will, at my prayer, I feel sure, use his influence in your favour when I tell him how you acted as my friend on landing in Spain from the Armada." Geoffrey then gave an account of his various adventures, from the time when he was struck down from the deck of the Barbary Corsair until the present time. "How was it," he asked when he concluded, "that you did not write to my parents, Gerald, on your return home? You knew where they lived." "I talked the matter over with Inez," Gerald replied, "and we agreed that it was kinder to them to be silent. Of course, they had mourned you as killed in the fight with the Armada. A year had passed, and the wound must have somewhat healed. Had I told them you had escaped death at that time, had been months with me in Spain, and had, on your way home, been either killed by the Moors or a prisoner in the galleys, it would have opened the wound afresh, and caused them renewed pain and sorrow. No doubt you are right, Gerald, and it was, as you say, the kindest thing to leave them in ignorance of my fate." Upon the next visit Sir Francis Vere paid to England, Geoffrey spoke to him with regard to Gerald Burke's affairs. Sir Francis took the matter up warmly, and his influence sufficed in a very short time to obtain an order for the restoration of Gerald of all his estates. Inez and Dolores became as fast friends as their husbands, and when the Burkes came to England, Geoffrey's house was their home. The meeting with Gerald was followed by a still greater surprise, for not many days after, when Geoffrey was sitting with his wife and Don Mendez under the shade of a broad cypress in the garden of the merchant's house at Chelsea, they saw a servant coming across towards them, followed by a man in seafaring attire. "Here is a person who would speak to you, Master Vickars," the servant said. "I told him it was not your custom to see any here, and that if he had aught to say, he should call at your house at St. Mary Axe. But he said that he had just arrived from Hedingham, and that your honour would excuse his intrusion when you saw him." "Bring him up. He may be the bearer of a message from my father," Geoffrey said, and the servant went back to the man, whom he had left a short distance off. "Master Vickars will speak to you." The sailor approached the party. He stood for a minute before Geoffrey without speaking. Geoffrey looked at him with surprise, and saw the muscles of his face were twitching, and that he was much agitated. As he looked at him, remembrance suddenly flashed across him, and he sprang to his feet. "Stephen Boldero!" he exclaimed. Aye, Geoffrey, it is me." For a time the men stood with their right hands clasped and their left on each other's shoulders. Tears fell down the sailor's weather-beaten cheeks, and Geoffrey himself was too moved to speak. For 2 years they had lived as brothers, had shared each other's toils and dangers, and had talked over their plans and hopes together, and it was to Stephen that Geoffrey owed it that he was not now a galley slave in Barbary. "Old friend, where have you been all this time?" he said at last. "I had thought you dead, and have grieved sorely for you." "I have had some narrow escapes," Stephen said, "but you know I am tough. I am worth a good many dead men yet. Dolores, Señor Mendez, you both remember Stephen Boldero," Geoffrey said, turning to them. "We have never forgotten you," the Spaniard said, shaking hands with the sailor, "nor how much we owe to you. I sent out instructions by every ship that sailed to the Indies that inquiries should be made for you, and moreover had letters sent by influential friends to the governors of most of the islands, saying that you had done great service to me and mine, and praying that if you were in any need or trouble you might be sent back to Cadiz, and that any moneys you required might be given to you at my charge. So we have heard naught of you from the day when the news came that you had left the ship in which you went out." "I have had a rough time of it these 5 years," Stephen said, "but I care not, now that I am home again and have found my friend Geoffrey. I arrived in Bristol but last week, and started for London on the day I landed, mindful of my promise to let his people know that he was safe and well, and with some faint hope that the capture of Cadiz had set him at liberty. I got to Hedingham last night, and if I had been a prince, Mr. Vickars and his dame, and Sir Lionel, could not have made more of me. They were fain that I should stop with them a day or two, but when I heard you were in London, and had married Señor Dolores, and that Señor Mendez was with you, all of which in no way surprised me, for methought I saw it coming before I left Cadiz, I could not rest, but was up at daylight this morning. Your brother offered to procure me a horse, but I should have made bad weather on the craft, and after walking from Bristol, the tramp up to London was nothing. I got to your house in the city at 4, and finding that you were here, took a boat at once, for I could not rest until I saw my friend again." Geoffrey at once took him into the house, and set him down to a meal, and when the party were gathered later on in the sitting room and the candles were lighted, Stephen told his story. As you will have heard, we made a good voyage to the Indies. We discharged our cargo and took in another. I learned that there were 2 English ships cruising near San Domingo, and the Dons were in great fear of them. I thought that my chance lay in joining them, so when we were at our nearest port to that island, I one night borrowed one of the ship's boats without asking leave, and made off. I knew the direction in which San Domingo lay, but no more. My hope was that I should either fall in with our ships at sea, or, when I made the island, should be able to gather such information as might guide me to them. When I first made the land, after being 4 days out, I cruised about till the provisions and water I had put on board were exhausted, and I could hold out no longer. Then I made for the island and landed. You may be sure I did not make for port, where I should be questioned, but ran ashore in a wooded bay that looked as if no one had ever set foot there before. I dragged the boat up beyond, as I thought, the reach of the sea, and started to hunt for food and water. I found enough berries and things to keep me alive, but not enough to stock my boat for another cruise. A week after I landed there was a tornado, and when it cleared off and I had recovered from my fright, for the trees were blown down like rushes, and I thought my last day was come, I found that the boat was washed away. I was mightily disheartened at this, and after much thinking made up my mind that there was naught for it but to keep along the shore until I arrived at a port, and then to give out that I was a shipwrecked sailor, and either try to get hold of another boat or take passage back to Spain and make a fresh start. However, the next morning, just as I was starting, a number of natives ran out of the bush and seized me, and carried me away up into the hills. It was not pleasant at first, for they lit a big fire and were going to set me on the top of it, taking me for a Spaniard. Seeing their intentions, I took to arguing with them, and told them in Spanish that I was no Spaniard, but an Englishman, and that I had been a slave to the Spaniards, and had escaped. Most of them understood some Spanish, having themselves been made to work as slaves in their plantations, and being all runaways from the tyranny of their masters. They knew, of course, that we were the enemies of the Spaniards, and had heard of places being sacked and ships taken by us. But they doubted my story for a long time, till at last one of them brought a crucifix that had somehow fallen into their hands, and held it up before me. When I struck it down, as a good Protestant should do, they saw that I was not of the Spanish religion, and so loosed my bonds and made much of me. They could tell me nothing of the whereabouts of our ships, for although they had seen vessels at times sail by, the poor creatures knew nothing of the difference of rig between an English craft and a Spaniard. I abode with them for 2 years, and aided them in their fights whenever the Spaniards sent out parties, which they did many times, to capture them. They were poor, timorous creatures, their spirits being altogether broken by the tyranny of the Dons. But when they saw that I feared them not, and was ready at any time to match myself against 2, or, if need be, 3 of the Spaniards, they plucked up heart, and in time came to fight so stoutly that the Spaniards thought it best to leave them alone, seeing that we had the advantage of knowing every foot of the woods, and were able to pounce down upon them when they were in straitened places, and forced to fight at a great disadvantage. I was regarded as a great chief by the natives, and could have gone on living with them comfortably enough, had not my thoughts been always turning homeward, and a great desire to be among my own people, from whom I had been so long separated, devoured me. At last a Spanish ship was driven ashore in a gale. She went to pieces, and every soul was drowned. When the gale abated, the natives went down to collect the stores driven ashore, and I found on the beach one of her boats washed up and almost uninjured. Nothing could do but I must sail away in her. The natives tried their hardest to persuade me to stay with them, but finding that my mind was fixed beyond recall, they gave way and did their best to aid me. The boat was well stored with provisions. We made a sail for her out of one belonging to the ship, and I set off, promising them that if I could not alight upon an English ship, I would return to them. I had intended to keep my promise, but things turned out otherwise. I had not been 2 days at sea when there was another storm, for at one time of the year they have tornadoes very frequently. I had nothing to do but to run for it, casting much of my provisions overboard to lighten the boat, and bailing without ceasing to keep out the water she took in. After running for many hours, I was, somewhere about midnight, cast on shore. I made a shift to save myself, and in the morning found that I was on a low quay. Here I lived for 3 weeks. Fortunately, there was water in some of the hollows of the rocks, and as turtles came ashore to lay their eggs, I managed pretty well for a time. But the water dried up, and for the last week I had naught to drink but the blood of the turtles. One morning I saw a ship passing not far off, and making a signal with the mast of the boat that had been washed ashore with me, I attracted their attention. I saw that she was a Spaniard, but I could not help that, for I had no choice but to hail her. They took me to Puerto Rico, and then reported me as a shipwrecked sailor they had picked up. The governor questioned me closely as to what vessel I had been lost from, and although I made up a good story, he had his doubts. Fortunately, it did not enter his mind that I was not a Spaniard, but he said he believed I was some bad character who had been marooned by my comrades for murder or some other crime, and so put me in prison until he could learn something that would verify my story. After 3 months I was taken out of prison, but was set to work on the fortifications, and there, for another 2 years, I had to stop. Then I managed to slip away one day, and hiding till nightfall, made my way down through the town to the quays, and swam out to a vessel at anchor. I climbed on board without notice, and hid myself below, where I lay for 2 days until she got up sail. When I judged she was well away from the land, I went on deck and told my story, that I was a shipwrecked sailor who had been forced by the governor to work the fortifications. They did not believe me, saying that I must be some criminal who had escaped from justice, and the captain said he should give me up at the next port the ship touched. Fortunately, 4 days afterwards a sail hove in sight, and gave chase, and before it was dark was near enough to fire a gun and make us heave to, and a quarter of an hour later a boat came alongside, and I again heard English spoken for the first time since I had left you at Cadiz. It was an English buccaneer, who, being short of water and fresh vegetables, had chased us, though seeing we were but a petty trader, and not likely to have aught else worth taking on board. They wondered much when I discovered myself to them, and told them who I was, and how I had come there, and when, on their rowing me on board their ship, I told the captain my story, he told me that he thought I was the greatest liar he had ever met. To be a galley slave among the Spaniards, a galley slave among the Moors, a consorter with Indians for 2 years, and again a prisoner with the Spaniards for as much more, was more than fell to the lot of any one man, and he, like the Spanish governor, believed that I was some rascal who had been marooned. Only he thought that it was from an English ship. However, he said that I was a stout fellow who would give me another chance, and when, a fortnight later, we fell in with a great Spanish galleon and captured her with a great store of prize money, after a hard fight for 6 hours, the last of which was passed on the deck of the Spaniard, cutting and slashing. For being laden with silver, she had a company of troops on board in addition to her crew. The captain said that though an astonishing liar, there was no better fellow on board a ship, and putting it to the crew, they agreed that I had well earned my share of the prize money. When we had got the silver on board, which was a heavy job, I can tell you, though not an unpleasant one, we put what Spaniards remained alive into the boats, fired the galleon, and set sail for England, where we arrived without adventure. The silver was divided on the day before we cast anchor, the owner's share being first set aside, every man his share, and the officers theirs in proportion. Mine came to over 1,000 pounds, and it needed 2 strong men to carry the chest up to the office of the owners, who gave me a receipt for it, which, as soon as I got, I started for London, and here, as you see, I am. "And now, what do you propose to do with yourself, Stephen?" Geoffrey asked. "I shall first travel down again to Devonshire, and see what friends I have remaining there. I do not expect to find many alive, for 15 years makes many changes. My father and mother were both dead before I started, and my uncle, with whom I lived for a time, is scarce like to be alive now. Still, I may find some cousins and friends I knew as a boy." "I should think you have had enough of the sea, Stephen, and you have now ample to live ashore in comfort for the rest of your life." "Yes, I shall go no more to sea," Stephen said. "Except for this last stroke of luck, fortune has always been against me. What I should like, Master Geoffrey, most of all, would be to come up and work under you. I could be of advantage in seeing to the loading and unloading vessels and the storage of cargo. As for pay, I should not want it, having, as you say, enough to live comfortably upon. Still, I should like to be with you. And I should like to have you with me, Stephen. Nothing would give me greater pleasure. If you are still of that mind when you return from Devonshire, we can again talk the matter over, and as our wishes are both the same way, we can have no difficulty in coming to an agreement." Stephen Boldero remained for a week in London, and then journeyed down to Devonshire. His idea of entering Geoffrey's service was never carried out, for after he had been gone 2 months, Geoffrey received a letter from him, saying that one of his cousins, who had been but a little girl when he went away, had laid her orders upon him to buy a small estate and settle down there, and that as she was willing to marry him on no other terms, he had nothing to do but to assent. Once a year, however, regularly, to the end of his life, Stephen Boldero came up to London to stay for a fortnight with Geoffrey, always coming by road, for he declared that he was convinced that if he set foot on board a ship again, she would infallibly be wrecked on her voyage to London. End of chapter 22. Old Friends. Recorded by Laura Brenner, close to Grettinger, Iowa, on May 9th, 2026. Chapter 23 of By England's Aid by G.A. Henty. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23, The Siege of Ostend. On the 5th of July, 1601, the Archduke Albert began the Siege of Ostend with 20,000 men and 50 siege guns. Ostend had been completely rebuilt and fortified 18 years previously, and was defended by ramparts, counterscarps, and 2 broad ditches. The sandhills between it and the sea were cut through, and the water filled the ditches and surrounded the town. To the south, the country was intersected by a network of canals. The river Ivry came in at the back of the town, and after mingling with the salt water in the ditches, found its way to the sea through the channels known as the Old Haven and the Gill, the first on the west, the second on the east of the town. On either side of these channels, the land rose slightly, enabling the besiegers to plant their batteries in very advantageous positions. The garrison at first consisted of but 2,000 men, under Governor van der Nood. The States General considered the defense of Ostend to be of extreme importance to the cause, and appointed Sir Francis Vere general of the army in and about Ostend, and sent with him 600 Dutch troops and 8 companies of English under the command of his brother, Sir Horace. This raised the garrison to the strength of 3,600 men. Sir Francis landed with these reinforcements on the sands opposite the old town, which stood near the seashore between the Old Haven and the Gill, and was separated from the new town by a broad channel. He was forced to land here as the Spanish guns on the sandhills commanded the entrances of the 2 channels. 16,000 of the Spanish troops under the order of the Archduke were encamped to the west of the town, and had 30 of their siege guns in position there, while 4,000 men were stationed on the east side of the town under Count Bucquoy. 10 guns were in position on that side. Ostend had no natural advantages for defense, beyond the facility of letting the sea into the numerous channels and ditches which intersected the city, and protected it from any operations on the south side. On the east, the Gill was broad and deep, and an assault from this side was very difficult. The Old Haven on the west side was fast filling up, and was fordable for 4 hours every tide. This, therefore, was the weak side of the town. The portion especially exposed to attack was the low sandy flat on which the old town stood, to the north of Ostend. It was against this point, separated only from the enemy's position by the shallow Old Haven, that the Spaniards concentrated their efforts. The defense here consisted of a work called the Porce Espic, and a bastion in its rear called the Helmond. These works lay to the north of the ditch dividing the old from the new town, while on the opposite side of the ditch was a fort called the Sandhill, from which along the sea face of the town ran strong palisades and bastions. The 3 principal bastions were named the Schottenberg, Moses' Table, and the Flamenberg, the last named defending the entrance to the Gill on the eastern side. There was a strong wall with 3 bastions, the north bulwark, the east bulwark, or Pekil, and the Spanish bulwark at the southeast angle, with an outwork called the Spanish half-moon on the other side of the Gill. The south side was similarly defended by a wall with 4 strong bastions, while beyond these at the southwest corner lay a field called the Polder, extending to the point where the Ypres ran into the ditches. Sir Francis Vere's first step after his arrival was to throw up 3 redoubts to strengthen the wall round this field, as had the enemy taken possession of it, they might have set the windmills upon it to work, and have drained out many of the ditches. Having secured this point, he cut a passage to the sea between the northwest bulwark and the Flamenberg fort, so that shipping might enter the port without having to ascend the Gill, exposed to the fire of the Spanish guns. To annoy the enemy and draw them away from the vital point near the sea, he then stationed 200 men on some rising ground, surrounded by swamps and ditches, at some distance to the south of the city, and here they were able to open fire on the enemy's boats coming with supplies from Bruges. The operation was successful. The Spaniards, finding their line of communication threatened, advanced in force from their position by the sea, and their forts opened a heavy fire upon the little work thrown up. Other similar attempts would have been made to harass the Spaniards and divert them from their main work, had not Sir Francis Vere been severely wounded in the head on the 4th of August by a shot from the Spanish batteries, which continued to keep up a tremendous fire upon the town. So serious was the wound that the surgeons were of opinion that the only chance of saving his life was to send him away from the din and turmoil of the siege, and on the 10th he was taken to Middelburg, where he remained for a month, returning to Ostend long before his wound was properly healed. On the 1st of August, a batch of recruits had arrived from England, and on the 8th 1,200 more were landed. The fire of the besiegers was now so heavy that the soldiers were forced to dig underground quarters to shelter themselves. Sir Horace Vere let out several sorties, but the besiegers, no longer distracted by the feints contrived by Sir Francis, succeeded in erecting a battery on the margin of the Old Haven, and opened fire on the Sandhill fort. On the 19th of September, Sir Francis Vere returned to the town, to the great joy of the garrison. Reinforcements continued to arrive, and at this time the garrison numbered 4,480. There were, too, a large number of noblemen and gentlemen from England, France, and Holland, who had come to learn the art of war under the man who was regarded as the greatest general of the time. All who were willing to work and learn were heartily welcomed. Those who were unwilling to do so were soon made to feel that a besieged city was no place for them. While the fighting was going on, the Archduke had attempted to capture the place by treason. He engaged a traitor named Coningsby, who crossed to England, obtained letters of introduction to Vere, and then went to Ostend. Thence he sent intelligence to the besiegers of all that took place in the town, placing his letters at night in an old boat sunk in the mud on the bank of the Old Haven, a Spaniard waiting across at low tide and fetching them away. He then attempted to bribe a sergeant to blow up the powder magazine. The sergeant revealed the plot. Coningsby was seized and confessed everything, and by an act of extraordinary clemency was only sentenced to be whipped out of the town. This act of treachery on the part of the Archduke justified the otherwise dishonorable stratagem afterwards played by Vere upon him. All through October and November, the Spaniards were hard at work advancing their batteries, sinking great baskets filled with sand in the Old Haven to facilitate the passage of the troops, and building floating batteries in the Gyle. On the night of the 4th of December, they advanced suddenly to the attack. Vere and his officers leaped from their beds and rushed to the walls, and after a fierce struggle, the besiegers were driven back. Straw was lighted to enable the musketeers and gunners to fire upon them as they retreated, and the assault cost them 500 lives. On the 12th, the hard frost set in, and until Christmas a strong gale from the southeast blew. No succor could reach the town. The garrison were dwindling fast, and ammunition falling short. It required fully 4,000 men to guard the walls and forts, while but 2,500 remained capable of bearing arms. It was known that the Archduke soon intended to make an assault with his whole force, and Vere knew that he could scarcely hope to repel it. He called a council of his chief officers, and asked their opinion whether with the present numbers all parts of the works should be manned in case of assault, and if not, whether it was advisable to withdraw the guards from all the outlying positions and to hold only the town. They were unanimously of opinion that the force was too small to defend the whole, but Sir Horace Vere and Sir John Ogle alone gave their advice to abandon the outlying forts, rather than endanger the loss of the town. The other officers were of opinion that all the works should be held, although they acknowledged that the disposable force was incapable of doing so. Some days elapsed, and Vere learned that the Spanish preparations were all complete, and that they were only waiting for a low tide to attack. Time was everything, for a change of wind would bring speedy succor. So without taking counsel with anyone, he sent Sir John Ogle, with the drummer, to the side of the Old Haven. Don Matteo Serrano came forward, and Ogle gave his message, which was that General Vere wished to have some qualified person to speak to him. This was reported to the Archduke, who agreed that Serrano and another Spanish officer should go into the town, and that Ogle and a comrade should come as hostages into the Spanish camp. Sir John Ogle took his friend Sir Charles Fairfax with him, and Serrano and Colonel Antonio crossed into Ostend. The two Englishmen were conducted by the Archduke, who asked Sir John Ogle to tell him if there was any deceit in the matter. Ogle answered that if there was, it was more than he knew, for Vere had simply charged him to carry the message, and that he and Fairfax had merely come as hostages for the safe return of the Spanish officers. Ogle was next asked whether he thought the general intended sincerely or not, and could only reply that he was altogether unacquainted with the general's purpose. The next morning, Serrano and Antonio returned without having seen Vere. The pretext on which they had been sent back was that there was some irregularity in their coming across. But instead of their being sent back across the Old Haven, they were sent across the Gyle, and had to make a long round to regain the Archduke's camp. Thus, a day and a night were gained. The next day, towards evening, the two Spanish officers were admitted into Ostend, and received very hospitably by Sir Francis. After supper, many healths were drunk, and then Sir Francis informed them to their astonishment that his proposal was not that he should surrender Ostend, but that the Archduke should raise the siege. But it was now far too late for them to return, and they went to bed in the general's quarters. During the 2 nights thus gained, the defenders had worked incessantly in repairing the palisades facing the point at which the attack would take place, a work that they had hitherto been unable to perform, owing to the tremendous fire that the Spaniards kept up night and day upon it. At break of day, 5 men of war from Zealand came to anchor off the town. They brought 400 men, and provisions and materials of war of all kinds. They were immediately landed under a heavy fire from the enemy's batteries on both sides. The firing awoke the 2 Spanish envoys, who inquired what was taking place. They were politely informed by Sir Francis Vere that succor had arrived, and that the negotiations were of course broken off, and they were accordingly sent back, while Ogle and Fairfax returned to Ostend. Vere's account of the transaction was that he had simply asked for 2 Spanish officers to speak with him. He had offered no terms, and there was, therefore, no breach of faith. The commander of a besieged town, he insisted, is always at liberty to propose a parley, which the enemy can accept or not as he chooses. At any rate, it was not for the Archduke, who had hired a traitor to corrupt the garrison, to make a complaint of treachery. 1,200 men were employed for the next 8 days in strengthening the works, Sir Francis being always with them at night when the water was low, encouraging them by his presence and example. Early in January, he learned that the enemy were preparing for the assault. On the 7th, a crushing fire was kept up on the poor Seswick, Helmont, and Sandhill forts. The Spaniards had by this time fired 163,200 cannon shot into the town, and scarcely a whole house was left standing. Towards evening, they were seen bringing scaling ladders to the opposite bank of the haven. 2,000 Italian and Spanish troops had been told off to attack the Sandhill. 2,000 were to assault the Helmond and the Porce Espic. 2 parties of 500 men each were to attack other works, while on the east side Count Bucquoy was to deliver a general assault. The English general watched all these preparations with the greatest vigilance. At high water he closed the west sluice, which let the water into the town ditch from the old haven in the rear of Helmond, in order to retain as much water as possible, and stationed his troops at the various points most threatened. Sir Horace Vere and Sir Charles Fairfax, with 12 weak companies, some of them reduced to 10 or 12 men, were stationed on the Sandhill. 4 of the strongest companies garrisoned the Porce Espic. 10 weak companies and 9 cannon loaded with musket balls defended the Helmont. These posts were commanded by Sergeant Major Carpenter and Captain Meetkirk. The rest of the force were disposed at the other threatened points. Sir Francis himself, with Sir Lionel Vickars at his right hand, took his post on the wall of the old town between the Sandhill and the Schottenberg, which had been damaged by the action of the waves during the gales, and by the enemy's shot. Barrels of ashes, heaps of stones and bricks, hoops bound with quibs and fireworks, ropes of pitch, hand grenades, and barrels of nails were collected in readiness to hurl down upon the assailants. At dusk, the besiegers ceased firing to allow the guns to cool. 2 engineer officers with 50 stout sappers, who each had a rose noble for every quarter of an hour's work, got onto the breach in front of the Sandhill and threw up a small breastwork, strengthened by palisades across it. An officer crept down towards the old haven, presently returned with the news that 2,000 of the enemy were wading across, and forming up in battalions on the Ostend side. Suddenly, a gun boomed out from the Archduke's camp as a signal to Bucquoy, and just as the night had fairly set in, the besiegers rushed to the assault from all points. They were received by a tremendous fire from the guns of the forts and the muskets of the soldiers. But, although the effect was serious, they did not hesitate a moment, but dashed forwards towards the foot of the sandhills and the wall of the old town, halted for a moment, poured in a volley, and then rushed into the breach against the walls. The volley had been harmless, for Vere had ordered the men to lie flat until it was given. As the Spaniards climbed up, barrels of ashes were emptied upon them, stones and heavy timbers hurled down, and flaming hoops cast over their necks. 3 times they climbed to the crest of the sandhills, and as many times gained a footing on the Schottenberg, but each time they were beaten back with great slaughter. As fiercely did they attack at the other points, but were everywhere repulsed. On the east side, 3 strong battalions of the enemy attacked the outwork across the gill, known as the Spanish half-moon. Vere, who was everywhere supervising the defense, ordered the weak garrison there to withdraw, and sent a soldier out to give himself up and to tell them that the half-moon was slenderly manned, and to offer to lead them in. The offer was accepted, and the Spaniards took possession of the work. The general's object was to occupy them and present their supporting their comrades in the western attack. The half-moon, indeed, was quite open towards the town. Tide was rising, and a heavy fire was opened upon the captors of the work from the batteries across the gill, and they were driven out with the loss of 300 men. At length, the assault was repulsed at all points, and the assailants began to retire across the old haven. No sooner did they begin to ford it than Vere opened the west sluice, and the water in the town ditch rushed down in a torrent, carrying numbers of the Spaniards away into the sea. Altogether, the assault cost the Spaniards 2,000 men. An enormous amount of plunder and arms, gold chains, jewels, and rich garments were obtained by the defenders from the bodies of the fallen. The loss of the garrison was only 30 killed and 100 wounded. The repulse of the grand attack upon Ostend by no means put an end to the siege. Sir Francis Vere, his brother Horace, Sir John Ogle, and Sir Lionel Vickars left, the general being summoned to assume command in the field. But the siege continued for 2 years and a half longer. Many assaults were repulsed during that time, and the town only surrendered on the 20th of September, 1604, when the sandhill, which was the key of the whole position, was at last captured by the Spaniards. It was but a heap of ruins which they had become possessed of after their 3 years' siege. Its capture had not only cost them an immense number of men and a vast amount of money, but the long and gallant defense had secured upon a firm basis the independence of Holland. While the whole available force of Spain had been so occupied, Prince Maurice and his English allies had captured town after town, and had beaten the enemy whenever they attempted to show themselves in the open field. They had more than counterbalanced the loss of Ostend by the recapture of Sluys, and had so lowered the Spanish pride that not long afterwards a 12 years' truce was concluded, which virtually brought the war to an end, and secured forever the independence of Holland. During the last year or two of the war, Sir Francis Vere, worn out by his fatigues and the countless wounds he had received in the service of the Netherlands, had resigned his command and retired to England, being succeeded in his position by Sir Horace. Lionel Vickars fought no more after he had borne his part in the repulse of the great assault against Ostend. He had barely recovered from the effect of the wound he had received in the Battle of Nieuport, and the fatigues and anxiety of the siege, together with the damp air from the marshes, brought on a serious attack of fever, which completely prostrated him as soon as the necessity for exertion had passed. He remained some weeks at The Hague, and then, being somewhat recovered, returned home. While throughout all England the greatest enthusiasm had been aroused by the victory of Nieuport and the repulse of the Spaniards at Ostend, the feeling was naturally higher in the Vere's county of Essex than elsewhere. As soon as Lionel Vickars was well enough to take any share in the gaieties, he received many invitations to stay at the great houses of the county, where most of the gentry were more or less closely connected with the Veres, and before he had been home many months he married Dorothy Wyndhurst, one of the richest heiresses in the county, and a cousin of the Veres. Thus, Geoffrey had, after Juan Mendez retired from taking any active part in the business, to work alone until his sons were old enough to join him in the business. As soon as they were able to undertake its active management, Geoffrey bought an estate near Hedingham, and there settled down, journeying occasionally to London, to see how the affairs of the house went on, and to give advice to his sons. Dolores had, 2 or 3 years after her arrival in England, embraced the faith of her husband, and although she complained a little at times of the English climate, she never once regretted the step she had taken in leaving her native Spain. End of Chapter 23. The Siege of Ostend. End of By England's Aid by G.A. Henty. Recorded by Laura Brenner, close to Grattinger, Iowa, on May 26, 2026.